Imagine standing at the edge of something so vast, so incomprehensibly deep, that every mountain range on dry land could be swallowed whole within it, and there would still be room left over. Imagine a darkness so complete, so absolute, that light itself becomes a stranger, an unwelcome guest that has never once touched the ancient stone walls that line its floor. Imagine pressures so crushing, so relentlessly powerful, that the very concept of survival seems like a cruel joke whispered into the void. Now imagine that this place is real. It exists right now at this very moment beneath the surface of our oceans. It is alive, it is active, and it holds secrets that our greatest scientists, our most advanced technologies, and our most brilliant minds have only just begun to scratch the surface of understanding. Welcome to the deepest frontier that has ever existed on this planet. Welcome to a journey that will take you further down than any human being has ever physically traveled, further down than the reach of sunlight, further down than the reach of sound as we know it, further down than the reach of almost everything we consider fundamental to life. And yet life is there, history is there, mystery is there, coiled in the darkness like something ancient and patient, waiting to be found. This is not simply a story about water. This is not simply a story about geology or marine biology or oceanography, though all of those disciplines will play their parts as our journey unfolds. This is a story about the fundamental nature of discovery itself, about what it means to push past the boundaries of the known world and find that the unknown world is stranger, richer, and more complex than anything we could have possibly imagined. This is a story about how the deepest places on Earth and the most silent chapters of human history are connected by a single, powerful truth, that we have barely begun to understand the world we live in. The ocean covers more than 70% of the surface of this planet, and yet the uncomfortable reality, the reality that most people go their entire lives without truly confronting, is that we have mapped less than a quarter of the ocean floor in meaningful detail. We have more comprehensive maps of the surface of Mars than we do of the bottom of our own oceans. The moon has been surveyed with greater precision than the deepest trenches that lie beneath the waves just a few miles offshore from populated coastlines. Think about that for a moment, really let it settle in. The most alien landscape in our entire solar system that we know more about than parts of our own world is not on some distant planet. It is here. It is beneath the surface of the sea. And it is full of wonders that defy imagination. In the hours ahead, we are going to descend into that darkness together. We are going to explore the single deepest point on the surface of the Earth, a place called Challenger Deep, nestled within the vast and terrifying geography of the Mariana Trench. We are going to visualize what that extraordinary landscape would look like if, through some impossible act of engineering or divine intervention, all the water were suddenly drained away, and we could stand at the rim of that abyss and simply look down. We are going to meet the creatures that somehow thrive in those crushing depths, bizarre, otherworldly organisms that have evolved solutions to problems of survival that we are only beginning to comprehend. We are going to explore the hydrothermal vents that dot the ocean floor like chimneys of a buried underworld, pumping superheated, mineral-rich water into the freezing darkness, and in doing so, supporting entire ecosystems that need no sunlight whatsoever to flourish. We are going to talk about a discovery so revolutionary, so potentially world-altering in its implications, that scientists are still struggling to fully process what it means. The discovery of what some researchers are now calling dark oxygen, generated not by photosynthesis, not by any biological process we previously understood, but by the rocks themselves sitting on the seafloor. Quietly splitting water molecules apart through a process of natural electrolysis and releasing oxygen into the deeps. If that sounds like something from a science fiction novel, hold on, because the reality is even more extraordinary than the fiction. We are going to discuss the bloop, one of the most famous and mysterious sounds ever recorded in the history of ocean exploration. A sound so powerful, so low in frequency, so unlike anything previously catalogued, that when scientists first detected it, They genuinely did not know what kind of creature or force could possibly have produced it. We are going to descend, metaphorically at least, into the Kola Superdeep Borehole, a project that pushed not down through water but through rock itself, drilling deeper into the Earth's crust than any human endeavor before or since, and in doing so revealing things about our planet's interior that overturned decades of accepted geological theory. And then, because the ocean is not the only keeper of ancient secrets, we are going to rise back to the surface and look at history through a lens that has been sharpened and clarified by recent scientific discoveries. We are going to stand in the shallow waters off the coast of Cuba and look at structures on the seafloor that have sent researchers into a frenzy of debate about what they are, who built them, and what their existence might mean for our understanding of ancient civilization. We are going to visit the volcanic ruins of Pompeii and discover that almost everything we thought we knew about the victims of that catastrophic eruption in 79 AD was wrong in ways that fundamentally changed the human story of that tragedy. We are going to look at the Nazca Lines, those enormous geoglyphs etched into the desert floor of Peru, through the revolutionary eyes of artificial intelligence, and find that AI has revealed features and figures that human observers missed entirely during decades of careful study. We are going to visit the ancient city of Petra, carved into rose-red stone in the desert, and find that recent excavations have unearthed discoveries that are changing our understanding of the Nabatean civilization and their extraordinary relationship with water, trade, and architecture. We are going to examine a mastodon skeleton pulled from the soil of Iowa and understand why this particular discovery has sent shockwaves through the paleontological community. We are going to look at mysterious underwater walls in the Baltic Sea and ancient stone structures in the Azores and ask the questions that science demands we ask. What are these? How old are they? Who or what made them? The world, as it turns out, is very much older, very much stranger, and very much more layered with hidden history than the textbooks have led us to believe. And the evidence for this, the hard, scientific, measurable, observable evidence, is emerging from the most unlikely places imaginable. From the bottom of the deepest trenches in the ocean floor, from the rock cores pulled up from 7 miles beneath the surface of the Earth, from the desert plains of South America, seen now with machine eyes that can detect what human eyes could not, from the volcanic ash of ancient Italy, from the shallow coastal waters of the Caribbean, from the windswept islands of the Mid-Atlantic. Every single one of these discoveries, taken individually, would be remarkable enough to warrant its own dedicated exploration. But when you look at them together, when you step back far enough to see the pattern that connects them, what emerges is something truly breathtaking. What emerges is the recognition that we are living through one of the most extraordinary periods of discovery in the entire history of human civilization. The tools we have developed, the technologies we have created, the methods of analysis we have refined and revolutionized, they are allowing us, right now in our own lifetimes, to answer questions that have haunted human beings for generations. And even as they answer old questions, they are raising new ones that are perhaps even more profound. So let us begin. Let us start at the very bottom, literally the very bottom of the world as we know it, and work our way up through layers of mystery and wonder and revelation. Let us start where the darkness is most complete, where the pressure is most extreme, where the alien character of our own planet is most dramatically on display. Let us start in the Mariana Trench. To understand the Mariana Trench, you first need to understand where it comes from, not just geographically, but geologically. The Earth's surface is not a single, solid shell. It is divided into enormous pieces, called tectonic plates, that float on the semi-molten rock of the mantle beneath them. These plates are in constant, slow motion, drifting, colliding, separating, and grinding against each other in a geological ballet that has been playing out for billions of years. When two of these plates collide, one of them, typically the denser of the two, is pushed downward beneath the other in a process called subduction. And where one plate dives beneath another, the ocean floor is dragged downward, creating an elongated depression in the seafloor that we call a trench. The Mariana Trench was created by exactly this process. It lies in the western Pacific Ocean, roughly 200 kilometers east of the Mariana Islands, a chain of volcanic islands that were themselves created by the very same tectonic activity. The Pacific Plate, moving westward, is being subducted beneath the Mariana Plate in a process that began tens of millions of years ago and continues to this day. The result of this geological collision is the deepest natural point on the surface of the Earth, a crescent-shaped scar in the ocean floor that stretches for approximately 2,550 kilometers and reaches depths that are, by any measure, extraordinary. The trench is divided into several distinct sections, each with its own character and geography. But it is the southernmost portion, a small, roughly oval depression at the very bottom of the system, that holds the record. This is Challenger Deep, named for the British survey vessel HMS Challenger, whose crew first plumbed its depths using simple rope and weight technology in 1875, and estimated its depth at approximately 8,184 meters, a remarkable measurement given the technology of the era, though we now know the true depth is considerably greater. More recent measurements using sophisticated sonar technology and direct sampling have placed the maximum depth of Challenger Deep at approximately 10,935 meters, or just under 11 kilometers. For context, and because context is everything when you are dealing with numbers this large, consider the following. Mount Everest, the tallest mountain on land, the peak that has claimed so many lives in the pursuit of its summit, stands at 8,849 meters above sea level. If you were to pick up Mount Everest and place it at the bottom of Challenger Deep, its summit would still be more than 2 kilometers beneath the surface of the ocean. The Mariana Trench is not just deep. It is almost surreally, mythologically deep in a way that challenges the human mind's ability to truly process the scale of what is being described. Now here is where the visualization becomes truly extraordinary. Imagine for a moment that through some impossible physical process, all of the water in the Pacific Ocean, every single drop of it, all 710 million cubic kilometers, were suddenly drained away. Imagine that you are standing at the edge of what was the ocean and looking out over the newly exposed seafloor. What would you see? The first thing you would notice as the water receded is that the seafloor is not flat. It is spectacularly, dramatically unflat. The mid-ocean ridges, enormous mountain ranges that run along the boundaries of tectonic plates, some of them stretching for tens of thousands of kilometers, would emerge from the water as vast mountain systems that dwarf anything visible on land. The mid-Atlantic ridge alone, if it were fully exposed, would be one of the most impressive geological features on the surface of the planet. These ridges reach heights of 2 to 3 kilometers above the surrounding seafloor, and some of their peaks actually do pierce the ocean's surface. Those peaks are what we call islands. The continental shelves would appear as broad, shallow plains extending outward from the edges of the landmasses, we know, gently sloping plains that were, during past ice ages when sea levels were significantly lower, actual dry land, walked upon by human beings and the animals they hunted. The English Channel would disappear. The shallow seas between many island chains would vanish. Vast new territories of flat, fertile-looking land would emerge from the retreating water. And then, as your eyes moved further from the continental margins and out toward the deep ocean basins, the seafloor would become progressively rougher, more complex, more alien. The abyssal plains, the broad, flat areas of the deep ocean floor, sediment-covered and ancient, would spread out before you in a vast, slightly undulating landscape. They are not perfectly flat, they are cut through by numerous smaller ridges and valleys, dotted with underwater mountains called seamounts, many of which rise thousands of meters from the surrounding floor without ever quite reaching the surface. And then, and this is where the visualization becomes truly dramatic, you would come to the edge of the Mariana Trench, and what you would see would be unlike anything else on the surface of the Earth. The walls of the trench would descend before you in a series of terraced drops, not a single sheer cliff face, but a complex, layered descent of rocky slopes and relatively flat benches, each step carrying you another few hundred meters downward into the abyss. The rock exposed on these walls would be ancient, some of it among the oldest oceanic crust on the planet, formed at a mid-ocean ridge tens of millions of years ago and carried across the Pacific by the slow westward drift of the Pacific Plate before being dragged down into this subduction zone. There would be evidence everywhere of the immense geological forces at work, fault lines cutting across the walls, zones of fractured and shattered rock where the enormous stresses of subduction have broken the crust apart, mineral deposits of extraordinary variety and complexity. The floor of the trench, when you finally reached it in your imagination, would be surprisingly, almost disconcertingly, flat. The constant rain of sediment from above, combined with the way that material accumulates over millions of years at the bottom of this narrow, enclosed system, has created a relatively level surface. But it is not empty, it is not featureless. There are small ridges and rises, subtle topographic variations that a geologist would find fascinating. And there are, crucially, signs of life, though we will come to those in detail shortly. The scale of what you would be looking at, standing at the surface and trying to comprehend the depth of the trench below you, is almost impossible to convey in words. Nearly 11 kilometers, that is greater than the distance between most major cities in close proximity to each other. It is a distance that, if oriented vertically, would take you from sea level to an altitude at which commercial aircraft normally cruise. And it is all happening downward, into the earth, into the cold and the pressure and the dark. The pressure at the bottom of Challenger Deep deserves particular attention because it is one of the most extreme physical conditions that exist anywhere on the surface of our planet, and understanding it is essential for understanding everything else about this environment. Pressure in the ocean increases with depth at a rate of approximately 1 atmosphere for every 10 meters of water. This means that at a depth of 10 meters, about the depth of a moderately deep swimming pool, the pressure is twice what it is at the surface. At 100 meters, it is 11 times surface pressure. At 1,000 meters, it is 100 times surface pressure. And at the bottom of Challenger Deep, at nearly 11,000 meters, the pressure is approximately 1,100 times what we experience at sea level. To put this in concrete terms, the pressure at the bottom of Challenger Deep is approximately 1,100 bar, or about 16,000 pounds per square inch. A human being, unprotected, transported to that depth would be instantly and catastrophically crushed. The air spaces in your body, your lungs, your sinuses, your middle ears would collapse in an instant. Your body's tissues, subjected to that kind of force, would be compressed and destroyed. No biological structure that evolved for life at the surface could survive for even a fraction of a second at those pressures. And yet, life survives there. Not just survives, thrives, exists in a variety of forms and strategies and adaptations that are, when you stop to think about them, among the most remarkable biological achievements on the planet. The creatures of the deep ocean have had millions of years to solve the problem of extreme pressure, and they have solved it in ways that are both elegant and sometimes deeply strange. The fundamental challenge is this: biological molecules, the proteins and enzymes that make life possible, are sensitive to pressure. Under high pressure, they tend to lose their shape, and when a biological molecule loses its shape, it loses its function. The enzymes that catalyze chemical reactions in your cells work because of their precise three-dimensional structure. Squeeze them hard enough and that structure deforms and the reaction stops. Deep-sea organisms have evolved several solutions to this problem. One of the most important involves the composition of their cell membranes. Cell membranes are made of phospholipids, molecules with a head that attracts water and a tail that repels it. The behavior of these molecules and the fluidity of the membrane they form is sensitive to both temperature and pressure. At the extreme cold and pressure of the deep ocean, ordinary cell membranes would become rigid and cease to function properly. Deep-sea organisms counteract this by incorporating more unsaturated fatty acids into their membranes. These have a different molecular structure that keeps fluid even under extreme conditions. At the molecular level, deep-sea organisms have also evolved versions of their key pressure-adapted molecules that maintain their functional shape even under conditions that would destroy their shallow water counterparts. This is not a small evolutionary achievement. It represents deep, fundamental changes in the organism's biochemistry, changes that have been refined over millions of generations of evolution in the crushing dark. One of the most iconic and visually striking residents of the deep ocean, though not specifically of the Mariana Trench itself, as it tends to live at somewhat shallower depths, is the blobfish. And the blobfish has a story that perfectly radically different the deep ocean environment is from anything we experience at the surface, and how catastrophically misleading it can be to judge a deep-sea creature by how it looks when it has been brought to the surface. The blobfish, technically Cycrolutes marcidus, has become something of an internet celebrity, largely on the basis of a single famous photograph that be a deeply sad, almost comically deflated face. A drooping, gelatinous mass of pale flesh with a prominent, downturned nose-like protuberance and an expression of melancholy resignation that has resonated strongly with a particular strain of internet humor. It has won contests to determine the world's ugliest animal. It has become a meme. It has been described in countless articles and social media posts as one of nature's great aesthetic failures. But here is the thing, that photograph is profoundly misleading. What you see in the famous blobfish photograph is not what a blobfish looks like. It is what a blobfish looks like after it has been hauled up from its native depth of approximately 900 to 1,200 meters and subjected to a catastrophic decompression that its body was never designed to handle. At those depths, the pressure is roughly 90 to 120 times surface pressure. The blobfish has adapted to this environment by having very little in the way of rigid body structure and a body composition that is mostly a gelatinous, slightly less dense than water tissue that allows it to maintain neutral buoyancy without the need for a swim bladder. A gas-filled organ that most shallower fish use to control their buoyancy, but that would be instantly and catastrophically crushed at the pressures of the deep ocean. When a blobfish is pulled up from its native depth in a fishing net, which is how most specimens have been obtained, as incidental bycatch in deep-sea trawling operations, the rapid decrease in external pressure causes its body tissues to expand and distort. The gelatinous substance that makes up much of its body, perfectly functional as a buoyancy aid at depth, becomes a shapeless, sagging mass at the surface. The creature's body, designed for an environment of crushing pressure, literally falls apart when that pressure is removed. In its native habitat, the blobfish looks more like a normal, if somewhat unremarkable, fish. It is compact, relatively streamlined, and adapted in form as well as in biochemistry to the environment it calls home. The lesson here is profound and applicable far beyond the specific case of this much maligned deep-sea fish, far deeper than aesthetics. The diversity of life in the deep ocean is staggering. The Mariana Trench alone has yielded organisms that would seem to belong more comfortably in a science fiction narrative than in a biology textbook. Researchers working in the trench have discovered species of amphipod, small, shrimp-like crustaceans, living in enormous abundances at depths below 6,000 meters, thriving in conditions that should, by any surface world logic, preclude complex animal life. They have found sea cucumbers, polychaete worms, foraminifera, single-celled organisms with elaborately beautiful shells, and a remarkable variety of microbial life that forms the foundation of the trench's food web. Some of the most fascinating creatures of the deep ocean are those that have evolved bioluminescence, the ability to produce their own light through chemical reactions. In the deep ocean, where sunlight does not penetrate, this ability serves multiple purposes. It can be used to attract prey, as in the iconic case of the anglerfish, which dangles a bioluminescent lure in front of its enormous mouth to draw curious animals within reach of its needle-like teeth. It can be used for communication between members of the same species, particularly important in the dark vastness of the deep ocean, where visual signals that work in daylight are useless. It can be used as a form of counter-illumination, a camouflage technique in which an organism produces light from its ventral surface to match the faint downwelling light from above, making itself invisible to predators lurking below. It is estimated that as many as 90% of deep-sea animals produce bioluminescence of some kind. In the upper layers of the ocean, bioluminescence is a relatively rare trick. In the deep ocean, it is the rule rather than the exception. The deep ocean, for all its characterization as a place of absolute darkness, is in fact a place where light is produced in extraordinary profusion. It is simply biological light, self-generated, flickering and pulsing in the dark rather than streaming down from above. The hydrothermal vents represent perhaps the most extraordinary ecosystem discovery of the 20th century, and given what the 20th century discovered, that is a significant statement. Hydrothermal vents are essentially hot springs on the ocean floor. They occur at places where tectonic activity allows seawater to percolate down through cracks in the seafloor, be heated by the magma below, become enriched with minerals dissolved from the surrounding rock, and then be ejected back into the ocean through vent openings. The water that comes out of these vents can be extremely hot, in some cases exceeding 400 degrees Celsius, though it does not boil because of the immense pressure, and it is loaded with sulfur compounds, metals, and other chemicals. When scientists first discovered hydrothermal vents in 1977, using the deep submersible research vessel Alvin near the Galapagos Rift, they were not expecting to find much of anything. The deep ocean floor was supposed to be a biological desert, a cold, dark, nutrient-poor environment where life existed only in sparse, scattered communities sustained by the slow rain of organic material drifting down from the sunlit surface waters above. What they found instead was one of the most biologically productive environments on the planet. Around the vent openings, they discovered enormous tube worms, some of them growing to more than 2 meters in length, clustered together in dense colonies. There were clams the size of dinner plates. There were mats of white bacteria covering the seafloor. There were crabs and shrimp and fish, all living in dense concentrations around these oases of heat and chemical energy in the deep dark. The key to understanding this abundance lies in a process called chemosynthesis, the biological equivalent of photosynthesis, but one that uses chemical energy rather than light energy to fix carbon and produce organic matter. In photosynthesis, plants and algae use the energy of sunlight to convert carbon dioxide and water into sugars and oxygen. In chemosynthesis, specialized bacteria use the energy released by chemical reactions, typically the oxidation of hydrogen sulfide, which is one of the main chemicals venting out of hydrothermal systems, to do the same thing. These bacteria become the base of the entire food web. They are grazed upon by animals like snails and amphipods. Those grazers are in turn preyed upon by larger animals, and so on up through an entire ecological community that has no dependence whatsoever on sunlight. This was a discovery of truly revolutionary significance. Before the hydrothermal vents were found, it was axiomatic in biology that all complex life on Earth ultimately depended on photosynthesis, that all food webs, no matter how long or complex, could be traced back to organisms that captured energy from sunlight. The discovery of chemosynthetic ecosystems at hydrothermal vents shattered this axiom. It demonstrated that life could be sustained entirely on chemical energy, without any reference to the sun at all. And the implications of this discovery extend far beyond Earth, because if life can exist without sunlight, then the requirement for a habitable planet to be within the Goldilocks zone of its star becomes considerably less constraining. Moons with liquid water oceans beneath their icy surfaces like Europa, orbiting Jupiter, and Enceladus, orbiting Saturn, became suddenly more interesting as potential homes for life. The hydrothermal vents are not all the same. There are different types, producing different chemical cocktails and supporting somewhat different communities of organisms. The most visually dramatic are the black smokers, vents that emit extremely hot up to 400 degrees C, metal-rich water that turns black as the dissolved metals precipitate out when the hot water meets the cold ocean. The precipitated minerals build up over time into the characteristic chimney structures that give black smokers their striking appearance, tall, dark towers rising from the seafloor, belching what looks like black smoke into the surrounding water. These structures can grow to remarkable heights. Some have been documented exceeding 60 meters before they eventually collapse under their own weight or are toppled by seismic activity. There are also white smokers, cooler vents that emit water enriched with lighter minerals like barium, calcium, and silicon, which precipitate out as white particles. And there is a remarkable type of hydrothermal structure called the Lost City Hydrothermal Field, discovered in 2000 on the flanks of an underwater mountain in the Atlantic Ocean. Lost City is different from typical hydrothermal vents in that it is not driven by volcanic heat, but by a chemical reaction called serpentinization, a reaction between seawater and a type of rock called peridotite. The structures at Lost City are made of carbonate minerals and can reach heights of up to 60 meters. They emit fluids that are not as hot as black smoker fluids, but are extremely alkaline, and they support their own distinctive community of organisms. Lost City is particularly interesting to researchers interested in the origin of life, because the chemistry of its fluids resembles some theoretical models of the chemistry of early Earth's oceans. The discovery of hydrothermal vent ecosystems fundamentally expanded our conception of the boundaries of life, and the story of those boundaries being pushed even further in ways that challenge our most basic assumptions about what life requires was about to get a great deal more interesting, thanks to a discovery made not at a hydrothermal vent, but on the flat, cold expanse of the abyssal plain. For decades, oceanographers studying the deep ocean floor have been aware of a peculiar class of geological objects called polymetallic nodules. These are roughly potato-shaped lumps of mineral material, primarily manganese, iron, nickel, cobalt, and copper, that form slowly over millions of years on the sediment surface of the deep ocean floor. They form through a process of precipitation, minerals slowly crystallizing out of solution around a nucleation point, which is often something as simple as a fragment of shell or a shark tooth. The growth rate is extraordinarily slow, on the order of millimeters per million years, making them among the most slowly formed geological objects on the planet. Polymetallic nodules were first described scientifically by the HMS Challenger expedition in the 1870s, the same expedition that first sounded the depth of what would later be called Challenger Deep. They have been recognized since then as an important potential resource, containing significant concentrations of metals that are in high demand for modern industrial and technological applications. This has made them a subject of intense interest from a commercial, and there is ongoing research and debate about the feasibility and environmental impact of deep-sea mining to extract them. But in recent years, these unassuming lumps of mineral material have revealed a secret that nobody anticipated, a discovery so unexpected, so fundamentally challenging to established understanding, that when the first reports of it began to emerge from the scientific community, the reaction ranged from fascinated excitement to frank disbelief. The discovery was this: polymetallic nodules can produce oxygen. Not biological oxygen, not the product of photosynthesis or any other biological process we had previously identified. Geological oxygen, generated through a process of natural electrolysis at depths far below any reach of sunlight in the cold dark of the abyssal plain. This discovery, made by researchers studying the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, a vast region of the Pacific Ocean floor particularly rich in polymetallic nodules, emerged from careful measurements of oxygen levels in sediment cores taken from areas where nodules were abundant. Scientists noticed something puzzling. Oxygen levels at the seafloor sediment interface were measurably higher than could be accounted for by the downward diffusion of oxygen from surface waters. There was more oxygen there than should have been. Something was producing it locally. The investigation that followed was careful, methodical, and ultimately startling in its conclusions. What the researchers discovered was that the polymetallic nodules were generating small but measurable electrical voltages, a consequence of the electrochemical differences between different mineral phases within the nodules and the surrounding seawater. And these electrical voltages were, it appears, sufficient to split water molecules, H2O, into their constituent hydrogen and oxygen through electrolysis. The same basic process that you might carry out in a high school chemistry class by running an electrical current through water, except that here the electricity was being generated naturally by geological processes in the darkness of the deep ocean. The implications of this discovery are difficult to overstate. If the geological production of oxygen by polymetallic nodules is as widespread as early evidence suggests, then the deep ocean floor may have been producing oxygen through this mechanism for an extraordinarily long time, potentially for as long as polymetallic nodules have existed, which could be hundreds of millions of years. This challenges the assumption that the oxygenation of the Earth's oceans and atmosphere was driven entirely by biological photosynthesis, an assumption that underpins much of our understanding of the history of life on Earth. It also has profound implications for the study of life in the deep ocean. If oxygen is being produced locally on the deep ocean floor, not just diffusing down from the surface, but actually being generated in situ, then it potentially supports aerobic life in regions and at depths where we might have assumed only anaerobic organisms could survive. It opens up the possibility that there are ecosystems on the deep ocean floor that are more complex and more dependent on this local oxygen production than we have previously realized. And with an extension of imagination that scientists are cautious about but cannot entirely resist, it raises the possibility that similar processes might operate on other ocean worlds in our solar system. Europa and Enceladus both have rocky seafloors beneath their ice-covered liquid water oceans. Those rocky seafloors are likely to contain mineral formations. If geological oxygen production through natural electrolysis is a real and significant process on Earth's ocean floors, then it might be occurring on those distant worlds as well, potentially supporting life in ways that had not previously been considered. The discovery has been called dark oxygen, a name that captures both its location in the perpetual darkness of the deep ocean and its paradoxical nature, a product we have always associated with light and biological activity being generated instead in complete darkness through a geological mechanism. It is, in the truest sense of the word, a revolutionary finding, one that is still being evaluated, replicated, and debated in the scientific community, but one that, if it holds up to scrutiny, will significantly reshape our understanding of Earth's geochemical history and the potential distribution of life in the universe. The deep ocean is a place of sounds as well as mysteries, sounds that travel through water far more efficiently than they travel through air, sounds that can propagate over thousands of kilometers and be detected by instruments on the other side of a vast ocean basin. Water is, in many ways, an excellent acoustic medium. Sound travels through it at approximately 1,500 meters per second, roughly 5 times faster than it travels through air, and can be channeled by temperature and pressure gradients in the ocean into what oceanographers call the SOFAR channel, sound fixing and ranging, a layer of water at a particular depth that acts like a natural acoustic waveguide, allowing sound to travel enormous distances with relatively little loss of energy. It was in this acoustic environment that, in the summer of 1997, the the scientific monitoring systems operated by oceanographic agencies recorded something they were not prepared for. The automated hydrophone arrays, networks of underwater microphones originally established to listen for submarine activity during the Cold War and subsequently repurposed for scientific ocean monitoring, detected a sound of extraordinary power. It was a low-frequency signal, rising in frequency over a period of about a minute before fading. It was detected simultaneously by hydrophone arrays located more than 5,000 kilometers apart from each other, which meant the sound had to have been enormously powerful at its source, powerful enough to cross the width of an ocean basin and still be detectable at that distance. The analysts who examined the recording gave it a name that captured both its audio character and the profound sense of puzzlement it induced. They called it the BLOOP. The BLOOP became one of the most discussed mysteries in the history of ocean science. The frequency and profile of the sound were consistent with those produced by biological organisms. Specifically, they resembled the sounds produced by very large animals. But the power of the signal, the sheer acoustic energy it represented, was beyond anything that any known marine animal could produce. Not blue whales, which are the loudest animals we know of. Not sperm whales, whose powerful sonar clicks are among the most intense biological sounds on the planet. Whatever had produced the bloop, if it were an animal, would have to be significantly larger than any marine animal on record. This, inevitably, gave rise to speculation. The internet in the early days of its full cultural flowering seized on the bloop with enormous enthusiasm. Giant sea monsters, unknown leviathans lurking in the abyssal deep. Whatever had produced that sound, the popular imagination was very much prepared to believe it was something magnificent and terrifying. The bloop became a cultural touchstone of deep-sea mystery, invoked whenever someone wanted to gesture at the idea that the ocean might be hiding something incomprehensibly large. The scientific explanation, when it eventually came, was somewhat less dramatic, but in its own way entirely fascinating. Analysis of the sound's characteristics over time, and particularly comparisons with sounds recorded from glaciological events, strongly suggested that the bloop was produced by a large ice quake. This is what happens when a large block of ice fractures, or when an iceberg breaks apart, or when significant calving events occur in the great ice sheets of the polar regions. The sounds produced by these events can be extremely powerful, can have frequency profiles similar to biological sounds, and can, under the right conditions, propagate enormous distances through the SOFAR channel. The location where the bloop was detected in the southern Pacific Ocean, relatively close to Antarctica, is consistent with this explanation. The Southern Ocean is a region of significant glaciological activity, and ice quakes and calving events are not uncommon. The particular geometry of the ocean in that region and the properties of the SOFAR channel could explain why this particular event was detected with such clarity and at such great distance. But the icequake explanation, while scientifically plausible and widely accepted in the oceanographic community, has not entirely satisfied everyone. Some researchers have noted that the specific frequency profile of the bloop does not perfectly match typical icequake signatures. The debate, while no longer at the forefront of scientific attention, has not been entirely resolved. And even if the bloop is conclusively explained as an icequake, which seems likely, the episode itself is instructive. It demonstrates just how poorly we understand the acoustic environment of the deep ocean, just how many sounds are propagating through those vast watery corridors that we have not yet cataloged or identified or explained. The ocean is a noisy place. Most of those noises we do not yet understand. While the ocean has been one of the primary arenas for exploring the unknown depths of our world, there is another kind of depth that has fascinated and challenged humanity, the depth of the solid earth itself. What lies beneath the surface of the land? What is the nature of the rock that extends downward beneath our feet for thousands of kilometers? What can we learn about the history of our planet by drilling down through its crust and examining the material we find there? These questions motivated one of the most extraordinary and least well-known engineering projects of the 20th century, a project that began during the height of the Cold War and continued for decades, reaching depths that no human technology had ever achieved before or has achieved since. This was the Kola Superdeep borehole, and its story is one of the most remarkable in the history of science and engineering. The project began in the northwestern part of what was then the Soviet Union, on the Kola Peninsula, a finger of land extending northward toward the Arctic, bounded by the Barents Sea to the north and the White Sea to the east. In 1970, Soviet scientists and engineers began drilling a borehole into the ancient Precambrian rock of the Kola Peninsula, with the ambition of reaching a depth of 15 kilometers, deeper than any borehole had ever been drilled, deeper than the thickness of the continental crust in many places, deep enough to potentially reveal the structure of the crust and mantle boundary in detail. The project was not a single continuous borehole. The main shaft, designated SG-3, was drilled to progressively greater depths over a period of more than 2 decades, with numerous technical difficulties, equipment failures, and unexpected geological conditions requiring constant adaptation and innovation. The drilling technology developed for the Kola project was in many ways revolutionary, nothing like it had existed before, and the engineers and scientists involved were solving problems that had no precedent. The borehole that resulted from all this effort and ingenuity is physically tiny. It has a diameter of only about 23 centimeters at the surface, narrowing to about 21 centimeters at depth. If you stood next to the wellhead at the surface, you could look down into a hole barely wider than a dinner plate. But that hole goes down and down and down for approximately 12.2 kilometers, or just over 7.5 miles. That is 12,200 meters into the solid rock of the Earth's crust. It is the deepest artificial penetration of the Earth's surface ever achieved. The record it set in 1989, when it surpassed the previous depth record, has never been broken. The conditions that the drilling team encountered as they went deeper became progressively more extreme. Temperature, as expected, increased with depth, but faster than the standard models had predicted. At 12 kilometers depth, the temperature was approximately 180 degrees Celsius, significantly higher than the 100 degrees that the models had anticipated. This higher than expected temperature, caused by a greater concentration of heat producing radioactive elements in the granite rock at depth than the models had assumed, was one of the project's most significant and surprising findings. It also contributed to the practical difficulties of drilling at such depths, since the extreme heat made the rock more plastic and difficult to work with, and caused significant engineering challenges for the drilling equipment. But temperature was not the most surprising thing the Kola borehole revealed. The geological surprises went far deeper, in every sense, than anyone had anticipated. Before the Kola project, the standard model of the continental crust held that it had a layered structure, that beneath the upper layer of granitic rock, at a depth that could be detected by seismic surveys, there would be a layer of denser rock called basalt. This boundary, called the Conrad discontinuity, was thought to be a genuine compositional boundary, a place where the mineralogy of the rock changed. The seismic waves that seismologists used to image the Earth's interior seemed to confirm this model. At the depth predicted for the Conrad discontinuity, seismic wave velocities changed in a way consistent with a transition from granite to basalt. The Kola borehole drilled through the predicted depth of the Conrad discontinuity and found no basalt. There was no compositional change. The rock remained granitic in character. What had caused the seismic discontinuity that had been interpreted as a granite to basalt transition was not a change in rock type, but a change in rock properties caused by the extreme pressure and temperature at that depth. The same type of rock, subjected to sufficient heat and pressure, changes its physical properties, including how seismic waves travel through it in ways that can mimic the signature of a compositional boundary. This was a significant revision to accepted geological theory. The Conrad discontinuity, a feature that had been included in standard models of crustal structure for decades, turned out not to represent what everyone thought it represented. The crust, at least in this part of the world, was not too layered in the way that had been assumed, and this had implications for how we modeled the structure of continental crust globally. Further surprises were waiting at even greater depths. At approximately 9 to 12 kilometers, the drill cores recovered from the borehole began to show evidence of something entirely unexpected: microscopic fossils, ancient microbial life, fossilized biological material preserved in the deep rock at depths and in conditions that, before the Kola project, would have been considered completely inhospitable to life of any kind. 24 distinct species of fossilized single-celled organisms were identified in rock cores from depths of approximately 6.7 kilometers and below. These were not contaminants from the drilling process. The geological context was clear. These were genuine fossils, preserved in rock that was approximately 2.7 billion years old, some of the most ancient biological material ever discovered. Their presence at these depths raised profound questions about the extent and the ancient origins of life on Earth, and about the conditions under which early life was able to exist. Perhaps the most astonishing discovery at the Kola borehole, however, was the presence of water, not surface water that had seeped down from above, but water that appeared to be native to the deep rock, water that had been trapped in the crystal structure of the minerals and had been slowly released by the pressure and temperature conditions at depth. This water was highly mineralized and had a distinctly different chemical signature from surface water. Its presence at such depths suggested that the Earth's crust held far more water than previously thought, locked away in the crystal structures of minerals, invisible to any surface measurement, but they're nonetheless incorporated into the very fabric of the deep rock. The Kola Superdeep borehole project continued drilling until 1992, when it halted at 12,262 meters due to unexpected technical difficulties. The extreme temperatures at that depth were causing the rock to behave in ways that made further drilling impractical with the available technology. The project was officially closed in 2005, and the borehole has since been sealed. But the scientific legacy of what was found in that narrow, improbably deep hole in the rock of the Kola Peninsula continues to inform and shape our understanding of the Earth's crust, the conditions of early life, and the distribution of water within our planet. The deep places of the Earth, whether measured in water or in rock, are not the only repositories of secrets that challenge our understanding of history. The oceans have also swallowed, over the course of millennia, a significant portion of the human story. Rising sea levels since the end of the last ice age, approximately 12,000 years ago, have drowned coastlines, submerged river valleys, flooded vast areas of low-lying land, and in doing so have hidden beneath the waves an unknown but certainly significant portion of the archaeological record of ancient humanity. This is not a minor footnote to the history of archaeology. During the last glacial maximum, the peak of the most recent ice age, about 20,000 years ago, sea levels were approximately 120 meters lower than they are today. This means that vast areas of what is now shallow continental shelf were then dry land that was almost certainly inhabited by early humans, who, like all people throughout history, tended to settle near coasts and rivers because those environments offered the richest and most reliable food resources. The flooding of these territories as the ice sheets melted was a process that played out over thousands of years, slow enough that many generations of people would have experienced it, but fast enough that the lands they lived on and the structures they built and the histories they carried were ultimately swallowed by the advancing sea. What archaeology and history we have missed as a result of this inundation is impossible to calculate. We do not know what was lost. We can only know that the coastal environments that human beings preferentially occupied for tens of thousands of years during the last ice age are now, in very large part, underwater. And that means our reconstruction of human prehistory is necessarily and significantly incomplete. In recent years, the development of better underwater survey technology, particularly high-resolution sonar mapping, and remotely operated vehicles capable of operating in relatively shallow water has allowed archaeologists to begin the process of exploring these drowned landscapes, and some of what they have found has been extraordinary. Among the most controversial and debated of these underwater discoveries is a collection of structures located in the shallow waters off the northwestern coast of Cuba. These structures were discovered in 2001 during a survey being conducted by a team of researchers including the marine engineers Paulina Zalitsky and Paul Weinsweg. Their vessel, using sonar equipment, detected what appeared to be an extensive area of regular, geometrical formations on the seafloor at a depth of approximately 600 to 700 meters, far deeper than the 120-meter mark that represents the lowest sea level during the last ice age. The sonar images revealed what appeared to be large, symmetrically arranged stone structures, objects that seemed to have the regularity and organization associated with constructed, rather than natural, formations. Subsequent investigation using remotely operated vehicles allowed the team to obtain visual confirmation that these were indeed unusual objects, large, smooth-sided stone forms arranged in what appeared to be planned patterns, some of them resembling pyramidal shapes, others more like flat-topped platforms or walls. The question of what these structures are, and particularly of how they came to be at such depths, immediately became the subject of intense scientific debate. And that debate has not been resolved. There are two broad categories of explanation. The first, and the more conventional, more scientifically cautious, is that these are natural geological formations. The ocean floor, particularly in tectonically active regions, can produce geological formations that are remarkably regular and geometric in appearance. Crystal growth, volcanic processes, and the fracturing patterns of certain types of rock can all produce shapes that at first glance might be mistaken for constructed structures. The second category of explanation, more speculative, more controversial, but not without its proponents, is that these structures are genuinely the remains of constructed buildings. If so, they represent a significant puzzle, because at 600 meters of depth, they are far too deep to have been built during any period of low sea level that corresponds to human presence in the region. The last time sea level was low enough to have exposed the Cuban shelf to a depth of 600 meters would have been a period of extraordinary glaciation, far beyond the most recent ice age, potentially tens of millions of years ago, far too long ago for any hominid, let alone modern humans, to have been building structures. Unless, of course, we are wrong about the sea level history of the region. Tectonic activity can dramatically alter the depth of the seafloor independently of sea level changes. A region that is today at 600 meters depth might have been at much shallower depths, or even above sea level, in the geologically recent past if significant tectonic subsidence has occurred. The geology of the Caribbean region, with its complex history of tectonic activity along the boundary between the Caribbean and North American plates, is not inconsistent with significant localized subsidence. The Cuban underwater structures have been compared, inevitably, given their location and the popular appetite for the idea, to the mythical city of Atlantis, the civilization described in the writings of the ancient Greek philosopher Plato that supposedly sank beneath the ocean in a cataclysmic event. But Zalitsky herself has been careful to distinguish between what the sonar data and visual surveys actually show, which is the presence of anomalous, regular structures on the seafloor, and the much larger interpretive leap of attributing them to a specific historical civilization. The scientific work required to determine the true nature of these structures, detailed geological mapping, sample collection for dating, comprehensive visual survey, is difficult and expensive to conduct at those depths, and the definitive answers have not yet been obtained. What is clear is that the structures are there. Whether they are natural or constructed, whether they represent the work of geological processes or of intelligent beings, they are real anomalies on the seafloor that deserve careful, thorough scientific investigation. And they represent one of many places around the world's coasts where the drowned landscapes of the past are offering up evidence that our understanding of ancient human and perhaps pre-human history is far less complete than we have assumed. The Azores, a group of 9 volcanic islands rising from the mid-Atlantic ridge in the middle of the North Atlantic Ocean, are a place of remarkable geological drama. These islands are the tips of enormous volcanic mountains rising from the ocean floor, built up by the same kind of hotspot volcanism that has created Hawaii in the Pacific. They are geologically young, tectonically active, and surrounded by some of the deepest water in the Atlantic Ocean. They are also, as it turns out, surrounded by some deeply puzzling underwater structures. In recent years, researchers exploring the seafloor around the Azores using sonar technology and remotely operated vehicles have identified a number of structures that do not fit neatly into the expected geological profile of a young volcanic island chain. Among these are what appear to be stone formations of considerable regularity, structures that, in at least some cases, appear to be aligned and organized in ways that suggest a non-random arrangement. The geological context of the Azores is complex. The islands are subject to significant volcanic activity and seismic events, which can produce a wide variety of rock formations and can also, over geological time, dramatically alter the shape and depth of the surrounding seafloor. The fracturing patterns of cooling lava and the columnar jointing that forms in certain types of volcanic rock as it cools can produce remarkably regular geometric structures that can be easily mistaken for constructed stonework. These natural explanations must always be the first to be considered and tested. But researchers familiar with the natural volcanic geology of the region have noted that some of the structures around the Azores have characteristics that are more difficult to explain purely through known geological processes. The regularity of some formations, their apparent alignment with each other, and in some cases their three-dimensional organization, have led a number of scientists and researchers to raise the possibility, carefully and with appropriate scientific caution, that some of these structures may require explanations that go beyond standard volcanic geology. The deeper implication, the one that haunts this kind of research, is that the Azores, sitting as they do in the middle of the Atlantic and rising from the mid-Atlantic ridge, have been identified by some theorists as a possible location for the kind of ancient civilization that Plato described. The mid-Atlantic ridge is, after all, a real and dramatic geological feature. The idea that a significant area of it could have been above sea level in the deep past, before volcanic activity and tectonic processes altered the local topography, is not inherently impossible. The exact mechanics would need to be worked out with careful attention to the geological evidence, and so far the evidence for this kind of interpretation remains contested. What is not contested is that the Azores represent a fascinating and underexplored underwater archaeological and geological frontier. The technology now exists to survey these areas in detail, to map the seafloor with high resolution, to collect rock samples for dating and analysis, and to conduct the kind of systematic investigation that would allow scientists to distinguish definitively between natural geological formations and constructed structures. That work is ongoing, and the results, as they emerge, will be closely watched. There is a wall at the bottom of the Baltic Sea that has been the subject of significant interest and debate in the scientific community in recent years. It lies at a depth of approximately 21 meters, much shallower than the Cuban structures or the Azorean formations, and it extends for approximately 971 meters across the seafloor of the Bay of Mecklenburg, not far from the German coastline. It is known informally as the Blinker Wall, and its origin has been a matter of genuine scientific controversy. The structure was identified during a sonar survey of the Baltic seafloor in 2023, conducted by a team of geologists from the University of Rostock. What the survey revealed was a long, narrow ridge of stones, a wall of approximately 1,600 stones, arranged in a roughly linear pattern extending across the seafloor. The stones themselves ranged in size from relatively small cobbles to larger boulders. The wall was approximately 1 meter in height and varied in width. The question that immediately confronted the researchers was, how did this get here? There are essentially two categories of explanation. The first is natural. During the last ice age, glaciers advancing across the region could have deposited stones in linear arrangements, a phenomenon known as a moraine. Some moraines do have a roughly wall-like appearance, and the Baltic seafloor has a complex history of glacial deposition. The second category of explanation is anthropogenic. Human beings built it, at a time when the Baltic Sea in this region was considerably shallower or even above sea level than it is today. The researchers who published the discovery, while acknowledging the natural explanation as a possibility, noted that the specific character of the stone arrangement was difficult to reconcile with known glacial deposition patterns. Moraines typically do not produce such narrow, linear structures with the degree of regularity observed in the Blinker Wall. The structure's characteristics, its relatively consistent height, its narrowness relative to its length, the way the stones are arranged, are more consistent with a deliberately constructed stone wall than with a glacially deposited ridge. If the Blinker Wall was indeed constructed by human beings, then it was built at a time when the area where it now lies was above sea level, which, given the depth of 21 meters, would have been approximately 10,000 to 11,000 years ago, during the period immediately following the last glacial maximum, when the Baltic was still a freshwater lake rather than a sea connected to the Atlantic. This timing would place the construction of the wall in the Mesolithic period, the Middle Stone Age, making it potentially one of the oldest human structures ever discovered. What purpose would a Mesolithic wall of nearly a kilometer in length have served? The researchers have suggested that it may have been a hunting structure, a drive lane designed to channel large animals like reindeer or elk toward hunters waiting at one end. Mesolithic hunter-gatherers in this region are known to have used exactly this kind of communal hunting strategy on land, constructing long lines of stakes or stones to funnel game animals. The people living on what is now the Baltic seafloor 10 to 11,000 years ago would have been living on the shores of a freshwater lake, hunting the abundant game of the post-glacial landscape and potentially constructing exactly this kind of large-scale hunting infrastructure. If this interpretation is correct, the Blinker Wall represents an extraordinary window into the lives and technologies of people who lived in a landscape that no longer exists, a landscape drowned by the sea as glaciers melted and sea levels rose around the world. It would be evidence that the drowned coastal and lacustrine landscapes of the post-glacial world were indeed inhabited by organized, capable human communities that left physical traces of their presence, traces that we are only now beginning to find, as our underwater survey technology reaches the resolution required to distinguish them from the natural features of the seafloor. The Baltic, with its relatively shallow depths and its well-understood history of sea level change, is in many ways an ideal place to look for drowned archaeological sites. And the discovery of the Blinker Wall suggests that this kind of systematic underwater archaeological survey is capable of revealing things of genuine historical significance. Similar surveys in other shallow coastal areas around the world, areas where we know human populations existed before sea level rise, may reveal additional examples of drowned human heritage preserved, ironically, by the very waters that might seem to have destroyed it. The story of how we explore and understand the past is not only a story of where we look, but also of what tools we bring to the looking. For most of the history of archaeology and history as disciplines, those tools have been primarily human Human eyes scanning the ground, human hands excavating the soil, human minds interpreting what they found in light of what was already known. These are powerful tools. The entire edifice of our historical knowledge has been built with them, but they have limitations. Human observers miss things. Human interpretation is shaped by existing assumptions. And some of the physical evidence of the past exists at a scale or in a format that exceeds what unaided human senses can detect. The emergence of artificial intelligence as an analytical tool has begun to change this in ways that are deeply exciting and sometimes surprising. One of the most dramatic demonstrations of what AI-powered analysis can reveal about the past has come from the Nazca Desert of southern Peru, where one of the most mysterious and visually spectacular collections of ancient art in the world, the Nazca Lines, has been re-examined with new technological eyes. The Nazca Lines are a collection of geoglyphs, large designs created on the ground surface by removing the reddish-brown iron oxide-coated pebbles that cover the desert and exposing the yellowish-gray ground beneath. They were created by the Nazca culture, which flourished in the region from roughly 200 BCE to 600 CE. The lines, figures, and geometric shapes they left behind are distributed across an area of approximately 450 square kilometers, and many of them are so large that they can only be properly seen and appreciated from the air, which, of course, raises the obvious question of how and why a pre-aviation culture would have created art that can only be fully seen from altitude. The Nazca Lines include both geometric figures, straight lines stretching for kilometers, trapezoids, spirals, and more complex geometric patterns, and figurative representations of animals, plants, and human-like figures. Among the most famous of the figurative geoglyphs are a spider, a condor, a hummingbird, a monkey with a curling tail, a dog, and a large humanoid figure with a strange rounded head that is often called the astronaut, though this nickname says more about the interpretive inclinations of certain observers than about any actual connection to space travel. For decades, archaeologists have studied the Nazca Lines using aerial photography, satellite imagery, and ground-level survey. These methods have been remarkably productive. Hundreds of individual geoglyphs have been cataloged and studied in detail. But the sheer scale of the Nazca region and the subtlety of some of the geoglyphs, which are often only detectable under specific lighting conditions or from specific angles, has meant that the catalog of known figures has grown slowly and that significant portions of the region remain incompletely surveyed. This is where artificial intelligence has made a dramatic contribution. Researchers from the Yamagata University in Japan, working in collaboration with IBM, have applied an AI system trained to recognize the subtle ground surface patterns associated with Nazca geoglyphs to a large dataset of high-resolution aerial and satellite imagery of the Nazca region. The results have been remarkable. The AI system identified more than 300 previously unknown geoglyphs in the imagery, more than doubling the number of known figures and revealing details of the Nazca cultural landscape that had been entirely invisible to previous human analysis of the same data. Some of the newly discovered figures are small, between 5 and 20 meters in size, and represent animals, humans, and objects that had not previously been seen in the Nazca repertoire. Others are larger but had been overlooked because their outlines were faint or interrupted by natural erosion. The AI system, trained on the known characteristics of Nazca geoglyphs, was able to pick out these faint, incomplete patterns from the background noise of the natural desert surface in a way that human analysts, even experienced ones, had been unable to do. Among the newly discovered figures are a two-headed snake, a llama, a fish, and a number of human figures in various poses. There are also several figures that do not clearly correspond to known natural subjects, shapes that may represent mythological or spiritual entities from the Nazca cultural system, or that may depict things whose identification requires further analysis. The discovery of so many new geoglyphs is significant not only for the sheer increase in the number of known figures, but also for what it reveals about the spatial distribution and internal organization of the Nazca geoglyph system. Having a more complete picture of where figures are located and what kinds of figures appear in different areas of the plateau allows researchers to begin building a more nuanced understanding of the meaning and function of the geoglyphs, questions that have been debated since the lines were first brought to widespread attention in the 20th century. The leading theories about the purpose of the Nazca Lines have evolved considerably over the decades. Early interpretations focused on astronomical alignments, the idea that the long straight lines pointed toward significant celestial events. While some alignments do exist, statistical analysis has suggested that they are not more numerous or precise than would be expected by chance, and the astronomical interpretation is no longer the dominant one in the scholarly community. More recent interpretations have emphasized the connection between the geoglyphs and water, specifically, the Nazca culture's sophisticated understanding of and relationship with underground water sources called puquios, which were essential for survival in one of the world's driest regions. Some researchers have argued that the geoglyphs were created as part of ritual practices connected to water, perhaps as offerings to supernatural beings or as part of ceremonial processions. The addition of more than 300 new figures to the dataset does not resolve these debates, but it does provide significantly more material for the analysis. And it demonstrates powerfully the potential of AI-assisted analysis to transform our understanding of archaeological landscapes that have been studied for decades but are still giving up new secrets. From the vast empty landscape of the Peruvian desert, let us move to one of the most densely documented catastrophes in all of ancient history, the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE and its devastation of the Roman city of Pompeii. This event is, in many ways, the most thoroughly studied ancient disaster we know of. The preservation of the city and its inhabitants beneath meters of volcanic ash and pumice has given archaeologists and historians an unparalleled window into daily life in a Roman city of the 1st century. The plaster casts of the victims, created by filling the voids left in the ash by decomposed bodies, are among the most haunting and iconic images in archaeology. And yet, despite all this documentation, all this study, all these decades of careful excavation and analysis, we have recently discovered that much of what we thought we knew about the victims of Vesuvius was wrong. Wrong in ways that are not minor technical corrections, but fundamental revisions to the human story of what happened on that terrible August day nearly 2,000 years ago. For much of the history of Pompeii's excavation, the identification of the victims in terms of their age, sex, social status, and the circumstances of their death was based primarily on visual analysis. Archaeologists examined the plaster casts, looked at skeletal features visible through or around the casts, and drew conclusions about who these people were and how they died. These analyses were conducted by experts using the best methods available at the time, and they generated a body of knowledge that appeared in textbooks and museum displays and academic publications for generations. But recent application of modern scientific techniques, including DNA analysis, isotope analysis, and advanced imaging technologies, has revealed that many of these identifications were incorrect. The revision has been sweeping. In one particularly striking example, a cast that was long interpreted as showing two women huddled together in their final moments, and presented to visitors for years as depicting a female couple or a mother and daughter, was revealed by DNA analysis to be two males. The assumptions built into the original visual analysis, apparently influenced by the arrangement of the bodies and perhaps by unconscious expectations about which social roles would lead to people being found together, had led to a systematic misidentification that went unchallenged for generations. This is not an isolated case. The DNA and isotope analysis of a significant number of Pompeii victims has revealed a pattern of misidentifications that suggests the visual methods previously used were subject to systematic biases and errors. Sex identifications based on skeletal morphology in the absence of genetic confirmation have proved to be unreliable in a significant proportion of cases, particularly for individuals at the ends of the age spectrum, children and older adults, in whom the skeletal markers of sex are less pronounced. The isotope analysis has added another dimension to the revision. The chemical composition of tooth enamel, which forms during childhood and does not change after formation, records information about the environment in which an individual grew up, specifically, the isotopic composition of the water and food they consumed. By analyzing these isotopic signatures, researchers have been able to determine that a significant proportion of Pompeii's inhabitants were not born in Pompeii or even in the immediate region. Some of them appear to have grown up in environments with quite different isotopic signatures, suggesting origins in other parts of the Roman world or even beyond the empire's boundaries. This finding has significant implications for our understanding of Roman Pompeii as a social and demographic entity. The city was not a simple, static community of locally born citizens. It was a dynamic, mobile, cosmopolitan place where people from distant parts of the known world came to live and work. The population included enslaved people from a wide variety of geographic origins, immigrants seeking economic opportunities, merchants and traders from across the Mediterranean and beyond. This picture of Pompeii as a genuinely diverse and geographically connected city is more consistent with what we know about the broader dynamics of the Roman world, but it is more complex and more human than the simpler narrative that earlier, less technically sophisticated analysis had allowed us to see. The new findings have required museums and archaeological sites to update their displays and their interpretation, a process that is ongoing. Some of the most famous casts have been re-examined and re-labeled. The stories told about individual victims have been revised, and the overall picture that emerges from these revisions is richer, more complex, and in many ways more poignant than the one it replaces, a picture of people who were not simple stereotypes but complex individuals with their own histories, their own journeys, their own connections to a world far larger than the city in which they died. The detective work of historical revision does not always begin with high technology. Sometimes it begins with a discovery so simple and so fundamental that it is the discovery itself, rather than the analytical method, that changes everything. In the summer of a recent year, a discovery of exactly this kind was made in the state of Iowa, a discovery that has sent ripples of excitement through the paleontological community, and that has important implications for our understanding of the megafauna that once roamed the North American continent. A mastodon skeleton, specifically, the partial but remarkably complete remains of an American mastodon, Mammoth americanum, was discovered during agricultural work in a rural area of Iowa. Mastodons were large, elephant-like mammals that roamed North America for millions of years before becoming extinct approximately 10,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age. They were related to, but distinct from, woolly mammoths. Both were proboscideans, the order of mammals that includes modern elephants, but they were in separate evolutionary lineages with different physical characteristics and different ecological roles. Mastodon remains are found periodically in North America. They are not extraordinarily rare, and each new discovery adds to the scientific record of these animals. But what makes the Iowa discovery particularly significant is a combination of factors. The completeness of the skeleton, which allows for detailed morphological analysis that is not possible with fragmentary remains. The quality of preservation, which has allowed the extraction of biological material for genetic and biochemical analysis. And the specific details of the anatomical evidence, which have revealed something about this individual animal's life and death that has proved to be scientifically important. Initial analysis of the skeleton has revealed evidence of injuries consistent with interaction with human hunters, not the simple presence of cut marks on bones, which can be ambiguous, but a more specific pattern of trauma that experienced paleontologists have interpreted as consistent with deliberate processing of the carcass by early humans. If this interpretation is correct, it adds to the growing body of evidence connecting early human hunters with the decline of North American megafauna at the end of the last ice age. The question of what caused the mass extinction of large mammals in North America at the end of the Pleistocene, roughly 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, is one of the longest-running debates in paleontology. The leading hypotheses have focused on two main drivers: climate change, as the planet warmed rapidly at the end of the last glacial period and transformed the ecosystems in which these animals lived, and human hunting pressure, as populations of early people spread across the continent and systematically hunted populations of large animals that had no prior experience with human predators and therefore had not evolved appropriate fear responses. The truth is almost certainly more complex than either of these simple narratives captures. Climate change and human hunting pressure likely interacted in complex ways, with the effects of each amplifying the other. A population of large animals already stressed by habitat change due to climate shifts would be much more vulnerable to hunting pressure than a healthy population in a stable environment. And the specific timing and geographic pattern of extinctions, which occurred progressively as human populations spread across the continent, is difficult to explain by climate alone. The Iowa mastodon, if its evidence of human interaction holds up to continued analysis, will add another data point to this important debate. Each well-documented case of human mastodon interaction helps researchers build a more precise picture of when, where, and under what circumstances early humans hunted these animals, information that is essential for understanding the respective roles of climate and hunting in the megafaunal extinction. Beyond the specific scientific question of extinction mechanisms, the discovery of a well-preserved mastodon skeleton always brings with it the possibility of extracting information about the individual animal's life, its diet, its movement patterns, its health history, its genetic relationships to other individuals and populations. Isotope analysis of the mastodon's teeth can reveal the environments it moved through during its lifetime. Ancient DNA, if it can be extracted and sequenced, can provide information about the genetic structure of mastodon populations across North America and how those populations were connected or isolated from each other. These lines of evidence, accumulated across multiple well-preserved specimens, are gradually painting a picture of mastodon biology and ecology that is considerably more detailed than anything available to previous generations of researchers. And now let us travel to one of the most dramatically beautiful and architecturally spectacular places on Earth, a city carved directly from the living rock of a rose-red sandstone canyon in the desert of what is today the country of Jordan. This is Petra, the capital of the Nabatean civilization, a city whose stunning facade of rock-cut buildings has made it one of the most photographed and recognizable archaeological sites in the world. But beyond its visual drama, Petra is a place that continues to yield new scientific discoveries that are reshaping our understanding of the Nabatean civilization and their extraordinary technical and cultural achievements. The Nabateans were a remarkable people. A formerly nomadic Arab people who built a sedentary civilization based on the control of trade routes across the ancient Near East. They developed Petra as their capital sometime in the 4th century BCE and maintained it as a major commercial and administrative center for several centuries, until the Roman annexation of the region in 106 CE. At the height of their power, the Nabateans controlled trade routes that connected the Arabian Peninsula, Egypt, the Mediterranean world, and the overland routes to Mesopotamia and beyond. Petra was the hub of this commercial network, a city of extraordinary wealth and sophistication, whose citizens were skilled merchants, engineers, artists, and administrators. The most immediately striking feature of Petra is its architecture. The elaborate facades of temples, tombs, and civic buildings carved directly into the faces of the sandstone cliffs. The most famous of these, the building known as the Treasury al-Khazne in Arabic, has become the iconic image of Petra, a towering, elaborately decorated facade carved with extraordinary precision into a cliff face, its columns and pediments and statuary emerging from the living rock as if conjured by a sculptor of superhuman skill. But the treasury is only one of many hundreds of rock-cut structures that make Petra one of the largest and most ambitious examples of rock-cut architecture in the ancient world. Less visually dramatic but equally impressive is the Nabatean water management system, an extraordinary network of channels, pipes, cisterns, and dams that allowed the inhabitants of Petra to survive and flourish in an environment that receives very limited rainfall. The Nabateans were masters of water harvesting and storage. They captured every drop of rainfall, channeling it through carefully designed systems into cisterns where it was stored against the long dry seasons. They managed flash floods, potentially dangerous events in an arid landscape where sudden, intense rainfall can send walls of water surging through narrow canyons, through a system of diversion channels and settling basins that turned a threat into a resource. This mastery of water in an arid environment was central to the Nabatean success story. It was what allowed them to maintain a large, settled population at a desert location that would otherwise have been uninhabitable at the required scale. Recent excavations and surveys at Petra have revealed new details of this water management system that have expanded our understanding of its sophistication and extent. Ground-penetrating radar surveys and careful excavation have revealed previously unknown hydraulic structures, channels and pipes that were not visible at the surface, that significantly increase our picture of how the system worked and how it was integrated with the overall urban planning of the city. But perhaps even more significantly, recent archaeological work at Petra has revealed evidence of monumental structures that were not previously known to exist. Satellite imagery analysis, combined with systematic ground truthing survey, identified a large rectangular platform structure near the city center, a structure whose scale and layout suggest it may have been a major civic or ceremonial building. The structure, which is approximately 56 meters long and 49 meters wide, appears to be surrounded by colonnaded walkways. An initial excavation has revealed artifacts consistent with a high-status, probably public function. The discovery of a significant monumental building in a site as extensively studied as Petra, a site where archaeologists have been working for more than a century and a half, is a reminder that even our best-studied ancient sites still have major surprises in store. The three-dimensional complexity of Petra, with its buildings and infrastructure developed over multiple centuries across a landscape of dramatic topographic variation, means that even after generations of careful archaeological work, a significant portion of the city remains unexcavated and unstudied. The new discoveries at Petra are also contributing to a broader reassessment of the Nabatean civilization, a civilization that has historically been somewhat underappreciated, perhaps partly because of the dramatic visual dominance of their rock-cut architecture, which can overshadow appreciation of their intellectual and technical achievements. The Nabateans were, among other things, sophisticated astronomers who developed detailed knowledge of the movements of celestial bodies for calendrical and navigational purposes. They were inventors of a script, Nabatean Aramaic, that was the direct ancestor of the Arabic script used today throughout the Arab world. They were skilled hydraulic engineers who demonstrated that a complex civilization could be sustained in extremely arid conditions through intelligent management of water resources. Understanding the full scope of Nabatean achievement requires understanding Petra in its full complexity, not just the facades visible from the main walkways of the tourist trail, but the complete urban system, the hydraulic infrastructure, the residential quarters, the commercial areas, the temple complexes, the road network, and the monumental civic architecture. Each new discovery adds a piece to this picture, and each piece makes the overall picture richer and more complex. We have traveled far in our journey so far. We have descended to the deepest point on Earth and explored the biology of creatures adapted to pressures that would instantly kill anything we recognize from the surface world. We have visited the hydrothermal vents that support entire ecosystems without a ray of sunlight, and we have learned about the revolutionary discovery of dark oxygen, geological oxygen, generated by the rocks of the deep ocean floor through natural electrolysis. We have listened to the mysterious bloop echoing through the deep ocean and descended metaphorically into the greatest hole ever drilled in the Earth's crust. We have explored drowned landscapes and the ancient cities they may hide, from the controversial structures off Cuba's coast to the puzzling formations around the Azores and the potentially Mesolithic wall on the floor of the Baltic Sea. We have looked at ancient history through the transforming lens of new technology, seeing the Nazca Lines more completely than ever before, revisiting the victims of Pompeii with the sharp eye of modern genetics, and examining fresh discoveries at Petra and in the soil of Iowa. And yet, for all of this, for all the ground we have covered and the mysteries we have explored, we have only begun. The deep ocean still has far more secrets to reveal. The history buried in the sediment of the seafloor and the rock of the continental shelves is still largely unread. The drowned landscapes of the world's continental shelves, once home to generations of human beings whose lives, whose cultures, whose stories have been swallowed by the rising sea, are just beginning to give up their evidence to the probing eyes of modern survey technology. What we have seen in this first part of our journey is, above all, a portrait of a world that is far more complex, far more layered, and far more surprising than any single framework of understanding can accommodate. The ocean is not simply a body of water. It is a living, dynamic system that generates its own light, produces its own oxygen, sustains its own ecosystems, and holds within its depths a record of Earth's history that we have barely begun to read. The dry land is not simply the stage on which human history played out. It conceals, beneath its surface and beneath the water that has covered its former coastlines, evidence of chapters of that history that have never appeared in any textbook. The scientists and researchers and explorers who are pursuing these discoveries, who are sending robots to the bottom of the Mariana Trench, drilling through kilometers of rock to sample the Earth's deep interior, scanning desert floors with satellite imagery interpreted by artificial intelligence, or diving in the shallow coastal waters of the Baltic and the Caribbean to look for traces of drowned civilizations, are doing something that has been central to the human story since the very beginning. They are exploring, they are pushing past the edge of the known world to find out what lies beyond, and they are finding that the world is larger, older, stranger, and more wonderful than any of us imagined it to be. In the second part of our journey, we will go further still. We will explore the complete picture of deep ocean biology in even greater depth. We will return to the question of what lies beneath the ocean's surface and examine the full scope of what has been discovered in recent years at the boundaries between the known and the unknown. We will look more closely at the dark oxygen discovery and what it might mean for the history of life not just on Earth but potentially elsewhere in the solar system. We will examine additional archaeological discoveries that are reshaping history. And we will ask and attempt to answer the question that underlies all of this. What does it mean to live on a planet that we still do not fully understand? For now, as we pause at the midpoint of our journey, what should stay with us is this: the darkness beneath the ocean's surface and the silence beneath the layers of history are not empty. They are full. Full of life, full of record, full of the evidence of processes and events and civilizations and organisms that have existed on this planet for far longer than we have been here to observe them. The challenge and the extraordinary privilege of our moment in history is that we have developed, for the first time, the tools required to begin reading what is written there. The abyss is not empty, it is speaking, and we are, at last, beginning to listen. Welcome back to our continuing journey through the deepest mysteries of our world. If you are just joining us, we encourage you to watch Part 1 first, where we descended into the Mariana Trench, explored the revolutionary discovery of dark oxygen, and began examining the archaeological discoveries that are reshaping our understanding of ancient history. And wherever you are watching from, whatever time it is where you are, please leave a comment below and subscribe to the channel so you never miss what we uncover next. There is a particular quality to the silence of the deep ocean that has no equivalent anywhere else on Earth. It is not the silence of an empty room, or the silence of a forest at night, or even the silence of a desert under the noon sun. It is something altogether different, a silence that is, paradoxically, full of pressure. Full of the slow, ancient movements of water, full of biological signals too faint for any instrument we have yet devised to fully capture, full of history so deep and so old that it makes the entire span of human civilization look like a brief, bright flash in an enormity of geological time. We left our journey at a significant moment. We had descended to the floor of the Mariana Trench, explored the extraordinary biology of creatures that thrive where nothing should be able to thrive, marveled at the hydrothermal vents and the ecosystems they sustain without a single photon of sunlight, and stood in intellectual wonder before the revolutionary discovery of dark oxygen, geological oxygen, generated by the rocks of the deep ocean floor through natural electrolysis. We had heard the echo of the bloop reverberating through the deep ocean, descended into the Kola Superdeep borehole, and begun to explore the drowned landscapes of ancient coastlines where human history has been swallowed by the sea. We had revisited Pompeii with the sharp tools of modern genetics, seen the Nazca Lines through the transforming eyes of artificial intelligence, and examined fresh discoveries at Petra carved into the ancient rose-red stone of the desert. Now we go further. Now we push past the places we have already explored and move into territory that is even less charted, even more challenging, even more fundamentally surprising in what it reveals about the world we live in. Because the story of the deep ocean and the hidden chapters of ancient history does not end with what we have already described. It continues deeper, older, stranger, and ultimately more illuminating about the nature of our planet and our place upon it than anything we have yet encountered. Let us begin where all deep ocean exploration ultimately must begin, with the water itself. Water covers more than 70% of the surface of this planet, and yet water truly understood, water as a physical and chemical substance examined with the rigor of modern science, is one of the most unusual and poorly understood substances in existence. This sounds paradoxical. Water is, after all, the most familiar substance in human experience. We are made of it, we drink it, we swim in it. We have been looking at it and living with it for the entire span of our existence. How can something so familiar be poorly understood? The answer is that familiarity is not the same as understanding. And water, when you examine it carefully with the tools of physics and chemistry, turns out to be deeply, fundamentally weird, a substance whose properties deviate so dramatically from what theoretical models predict that it has been described, only partially in jest, as one of the great ongoing embarrassments of physical chemistry. Consider, for a start, the simple fact that water expands when it freezes. Most substances, when they cool and solidify, become denser, their molecules slow down, pack together more tightly, and occupy less volume. Water does the opposite. When water freezes into ice, its molecules arrange themselves into a crystalline structure that is actually less dense than liquid water. This is why ice floats. And the fact that ice floats is, when you follow the implications, one of the most ecologically significant properties any substance has ever had. If ice sank, if water behaved like most substances and became denser when it solidified, the consequences for life on Earth would be catastrophic. Lakes and ponds would freeze from the bottom up rather than from the top down. The ice forming at the bottom would insulate itself from the water above, allowing more ice to form, eventually freezing entire bodies of water solid from the bottom to the top. In temperate and polar regions, this would make liquid water unavailable for most of the year. The kind of aquatic ecosystems that have existed on this planet for hundreds of millions of years, the ecosystems that were the cradle of complex animal life, would not have developed in the same way if they had developed at all. The anomalous expansion of water on freezing and the resulting buoyancy of ice is not just a physical curiosity. It is one of the foundational conditions for the existence of life on Earth as we know it. And it is one of several deeply unusual properties that make water such an extraordinary solvent, such an extraordinary medium for biological processes, and such an extraordinary shaper of planetary environments. The deep ocean is where water's most extreme properties are on display. The pressure gradient that we described in Part 1, that relentless increase in the force exerted on every surface as you descend, interacts with water's physical properties in ways that are still not completely understood. Deep ocean water is slightly denser than surface water, compressed by the weight of water above it, but it does not behave exactly as a simple compressible fluid would predict. The relationship between pressure, temperature, salinity, and density in the deep ocean is complex enough that modeling it accurately requires accounting for effects that are negligible in everyday contexts, but become significant at the extreme conditions of the abyss. The circulation of the deep ocean, the slow, global conveyor belt of water movement that oceanographers call thermohaline circulation, is driven by exactly these density relationships. Cold, salty water, which is denser than warm, fresh water, sinks in certain regions of the ocean, particularly in the North Atlantic and around Antarctica, and flows along the ocean floor as a slow, deep current. This deep water is eventually pushed upward by new sinking water, warming as it rises, and eventually returning to the surface where it can be warmed by sunlight and begin the cycle again. This circulation pattern, which plays a critical role in regulating the climate of the entire planet by distributing heat from the tropics toward the poles, operates on timescales of hundreds to thousands of years. The deep water that is currently flowing along the floors of the world's ocean basins may have last been at the surface during periods that predate human civilization. This slow circulation means that the deep ocean is, in a very real sense, a time capsule. The chemical composition of deep ocean water, its dissolved gases, its mineral content, its biological signatures, reflects conditions at the ocean's surface from centuries or millennia ago. By carefully analyzing the chemistry of deep ocean water, oceanographers can reconstruct aspects of past ocean conditions and, by extension, past climate states. The deep ocean floor itself, covered in sediment that has been accumulating for millions of years, is an even more detailed archive, a geological record of climate, biology, and Earth system processes that extends back further in time than almost any other continuous archive available to science. The sediments of the deep ocean floor are layered in a way that preserves a sequential record of the conditions that prevailed at the ocean's surface at the time each layer was deposited. The shells of microscopic organisms, foraminifera, coccoliths, radiolaria, that once lived in the surface waters and upon dying sank to the bottom, are preserved in the sediment in extraordinary numbers. The chemical composition of these shells, particularly the ratios of different oxygen isotopes incorporated into their calcium carbonate structures, is sensitive to the temperature and chemistry of the water in which the organisms lived. By analyzing these isotopic signatures in a sequence of sediment layers, researchers can reconstruct a continuous record of past ocean temperatures going back millions of years. This kind of paleoclimate reconstruction, based on deep ocean sediment cores, has been one of the great scientific achievements of the 20th century. It has allowed researchers to document, in quantitative detail, the pattern of ice ages and interglacial periods that has characterized Earth's climate for the past several million years. The glacial cycles that have built and melted ice sheets, lowered and raised sea levels, and repeatedly transformed the distribution of habitats available to life across the planet's surface. And it has revealed with sobering clarity the speed and magnitude of the climate changes currently underway relative to the natural variability documented in the geological record. But the deep ocean sediment record is not just a climate archive. It is also a biological archive, a record of the evolution and extinction of marine life going back hundreds of millions of years. The layers of sediment preserve not just the shells of organisms, but also the chemical signatures of biological productivity at the ocean's surface. The evidence of mass extinction, events in the sudden disappearance of particular species from the record, and the evidence of biological recovery following those extinctions in the gradual rediversification of the assemblages that follow. Reading this record layer by layer through sediment cores pulled from kilometers of water is one of the most powerful ways we have of understanding the history of life on Earth. Among the most extraordinary chapters in the biological history recorded in the deep ocean sediments is the story of the largest mass extinction event in the history of complex animal life, the Permian-Triassic extinction event, which occurred approximately 252 million years ago and eliminated an estimated 90 to 96% of all marine species and approximately 70% of terrestrial vertebrate species. This event, sometimes called the Great Dying, dwarfs even the more famous end Cretaceous extinction that killed the non-avian dinosaurs. It was a near total collapse of the biosphere, a catastrophe so severe that life on Earth came genuinely close to being extinguished entirely. The evidence for the Permian-Triassic extinction is preserved with devastating clarity in the sediment record of the deep ocean. Below the boundary layer, the thin band of rock that marks the end of the Permian period, the sediments are rich in the shells and chemical signatures of a diverse, abundant marine ecosystem. Above it, those signatures collapse, the diversity crashes, the abundance crashes. For millions of years above the boundary, the sediment record shows a world struggling to recover, with low-diversity ecosystems gradually, painfully rebuilding themselves toward something approaching pre-extinction complexity. The causes of the Permian-Triassic extinction are still debated, but the leading hypothesis involves a massive pulse of volcanic activity in what is now Siberia. The eruption of the Siberian Traps, a flood basalt province of extraordinary scale that released enormous quantities of carbon dioxide and other gases into the atmosphere over a period of tens to hundreds of thousands of years. This massive carbon injection drove rapid warming, ocean acidification, and the development of widespread ocean anoxia, a condition in which the deep ocean becomes depleted of oxygen, creating zones inhospitable to aerobic life. The combination of these stresses appears to have been enough to push the biosphere past a catastrophic tipping point. The deep ocean record of this event provides crucial evidence for the sequence and mechanisms of the collapse. Isotopic analyses of sediment cores spanning the Permian-Triassic boundary have allowed researchers to document the timing and magnitude of carbon cycle perturbations, ocean temperature changes, and anoxic events with a level of precision that would be impossible to achieve from surface outcrops alone. The deep ocean, in preserving this record, has given us one of our most important tools for understanding how planetary catastrophes unfold, and implicitly for thinking about the conditions that might lead to such catastrophes in the future. The recovery from the Permian-Triassic extinction, as documented in the deep ocean sediment record, was painfully slow. For approximately 5 to 10 million years after the extinction event, global ecosystems remained in a depressed state, low diversity, low complexity, dominated by opportunistic species that could tolerate the difficult conditions. The gradual rebuilding of ecosystem complexity, the return of diverse marine communities, the evolution of new groups of organisms to fill the ecological roles vacated by the extinction, took tens of millions of years. The deep ocean record shows this recovery unfolding in slow, halting steps, punctuated by secondary stresses that repeatedly set back the rebuilding process. Understanding this deep time history, the history of mass extinction and recovery preserved in the sediment of the ocean floor, is not merely an exercise in academic paleontology. It is directly relevant to the present moment, in which human activities are driving rates of species loss that some researchers have compared to past mass extinction events. The deep ocean record shows, with the unambiguous authority of geological evidence, what happens to the biosphere when environmental stresses exceed certain thresholds, and how long it takes for the consequences to be reversed, if they can be reversed at all. It is a warning written in stone and preserved in darkness, waiting to be read. The creatures of the deep ocean, as we explored in Part 1, have developed extraordinary adaptations to the extreme conditions of their environment, but the full extent of deep ocean biological diversity and the extraordinary variety of strategies that evolution has deployed in this challenging environment goes far beyond what we have yet described. The deep ocean is not a single, uniform environment. It is a complex mosaic of different habitats, each with its own physical and chemical character, each hosting its own community of organisms adapted to its specific conditions. The water column of the deep ocean is itself divided into distinct zones, each with different light levels, pressure ranges, and biological communities. The mesopelagic zone, extending from approximately 200 to 1,000 meters depth, is the twilight zone, too deep for photosynthesis, but still receiving a faint glimmer of light from above. This is a region of intense biological activity, where many organisms migrate vertically on a daily basis, rising toward the surface at night to feed in the more productive, shallower waters, and descending back into the dark during the day to avoid predators. This daily vertical migration is, by biomass, one of the largest animal movements on the planet, an enormous pulsing of life up and down through hundreds of meters of water every 24 hours. The bathypelagic zone, from 1,000 to 4,000 meters, is completely dark and intensely cold. Temperatures typically range from 2 to 4 degrees Celsius. The organisms that live here are among the most bizarre and fascinating in the deep ocean, anglerfish trailing their bioluminescent lures, viperfish with their enormous, fang-filled mouths, gulper eels that can swallow prey larger than themselves thanks to their enormous hinged jaws. These animals have evolved in an environment where food is scarce and encounters with potential prey are rare, and their anatomies reflect the premium placed on maximizing the success of any predatory opportunity. The gulper eel's enormous mouth and expandable stomach allow it to consume prey items that would be impossible for a more normally proportioned fish. Because in an environment where meals may be separated by days or weeks, the ability to take maximum advantage of any opportunity is critically important. The abyssopelagic zone, from 4,000 to 6,000 meters, and the hadopelagic zone, from 6,000 meters to the bottom of the deepest trenches, represent the most extreme environments in the deep ocean. Here, pressure reaches levels that would have seemed incompatible with complex life before the discoveries of the 20th century, and yet complex life is present. The amphipods of the hadal zone, small crustaceans that scavenge anything that sinks to the bottom, have been found in extraordinary densities in trench environments. They aggregate in large numbers around food falls, the carcasses of fish, whales, or other organisms that sink to the bottom and provide a sudden, concentrated pulse of nutrition in an otherwise nutrient-poor environment. A whale fall, the corpse of a large whale settling onto the deep seafloor, can support a succession of biological communities for decades, as different organisms colonize and consume the resource in sequence. This is a process known, evocatively, as whale fall ecology, and it has been studied with fascination since the first deliberate observations were made in the late 20th century. The first stage of whale fall succession involves the rapid arrival of mobile scavengers, sharks, sleeper sharks, hagfish, and the ubiquitous amphipods that strip the soft tissue from the carcass in a matter of months. The second stage sees colonization by enrichment opportunists, polychaete worms, and crustaceans that exploit the organic-rich sediments around the bones. And the third stage, the sulfophilic stage, is perhaps the most remarkable. As bacteria begin to decompose the lipid-rich whale bones, they release hydrogen sulfide, which supports a chemosynthetic community similar in some ways to those found at hydrothermal vents. Mats of bacteria, communities of mussels and clams harboring chemosynthetic symbionts, and associated grazers and predators create a self-sustaining ecosystem fueled by the sulfur chemistry of decomposing bone. A single large whale carcass can maintain this kind of community for 100 years or more. The ecological significance of whale falls in the deep ocean goes beyond the immediate biological community they support. Researchers have proposed that whale falls may have served as stepping stones in the evolutionary colonization of chemosynthetic habitats, that populations of organisms adapted to the hydrogen sulfide chemistry of whale bones may have colonized hydrothermal vents and cold seeps by dispersing from one whale fall to another across the deep ocean floor. If this is correct, then the historical abundance of large whales, before commercial whaling dramatically reduced whale populations, would have been an important driver of deep ocean biological diversity, and the decimation of whale populations by whaling would have had consequences for the deep ocean ecosystem that are far more profound than the simple removal of the whales themselves. Cold seeps are another category of deep ocean habitat that deserves careful attention, not only for their intrinsic biological interest, but also for what they reveal about the subsurface geology of the ocean floor. Cold seeps are places on the seafloor where fluids, typically rich in methane and other hydrocarbons, or in hydrogen sulfide, percolate upward from below the sediment surface and are released into the overlying water. Unlike hydrothermal vents, cold seeps do not involve elevated temperatures. The fluids they emit are at roughly the same temperature as the surrounding bottom water. But like hydrothermal vents, they support chemosynthetic ecosystems that exploit the chemical energy in the seeping fluids. The fluids at cold seeps come from a variety of sources. In many cases, they originate in the sediment itself, in the microbial decomposition of buried organic material that produces methane, or in the chemical reactions between seawater and subsurface minerals that produce hydrogen sulfide. In other cases, particularly along active continental margins, they may originate from deeper within the earth, from the subduction of organic-rich sediments, or from the devolatilization of minerals as they are carried into the mantle. Cold seeps are found in many parts of the world's oceans, often associated with continental margins, subduction zones, and areas of rapidly accumulating sediment. They host communities of organisms that are in some ways similar to those found at hydrothermal vents, chemosynthetic bacteria, tube worms, clams, and mussels with bacterial symbionts, and a variety of associated organisms. But they also have their own distinctive characteristics and their own particular species. One of the most fascinating features associated with cold seeps is the methane hydrate, a form of water ice in which methane molecules are trapped within a cage-like structure of water molecules, forming a solid at the pressure and temperature conditions typical of the seafloor in many seep environments. Methane hydrates, sometimes called clathrates, are found in enormous quantities on continental margins around the world. The total amount of carbon stored in methane hydrates in the ocean is estimated to be enormous, potentially exceeding the total carbon in all other fossil fuels combined, though estimates vary widely. Methane hydrates are stable only within a specific range of pressure and temperature conditions. the conditions that happen to prevail on continental margins at depths between roughly 300 and 2,000 meters. Outside this stability zone, if temperatures warm, or if pressure decreases due to changes in sea level or sediment loading, methane hydrates destabilize and the methane they contain is released, potentially in large quantities, into the water column and ultimately into the atmosphere. Methane is a potent greenhouse gas, significantly more powerful than carbon dioxide on a short-term basis, and the destabilization of oceanic methane hydrates during periods of rapid climate warming has been proposed as a potential amplifying feedback mechanism in past warm periods and as a potential concern for the future. The biology of cold seep communities is intertwined with the chemistry of the seeping fluids in fascinating ways. The tube worms that are among the most visually dramatic inhabitants of cold seeps, long, white cylinders of remarkable longevity, some individuals believed to live for several centuries, have no digestive system in the conventional sense. Instead, they host populations of chemosynthetic bacteria within a specialized organ called the trophosome, and these bacteria use the hydrogen sulfide or methane in the seeping fluids as an energy source, fixing carbon and producing organic molecules that the tube worm absorbs as nutrition. The tube worm and its bacterial partners are in a relationship of obligate mutualism. Neither can survive without the other. The clams and mussels found at cold seeps similarly host chemosynthetic bacteria in their gills, a fundamentally different relationship from the filter-feeding strategy of their shallow water relatives, and one that has evolved independently multiple times in different deep sea lineages in response to the opportunities presented by chemosynthetic environments. The convergent evolution of chemosymbiosis, the hosting of chemosynthetic bacteria as a nutritional strategy, in so many different groups of animals at cold seeps and hydrothermal vents, tells us something profound about the power of this particular ecological opportunity, and about the capacity of evolution to find the same solution repeatedly when the same opportunity presents itself. The microorganisms of the deep ocean, the bacteria, archaea, and other single-celled organisms that form the foundation of deep-sea food webs and drive the chemical cycles of the ocean floor, deserve far more attention than they typically receive in popular accounts of deep ocean biology. These organisms are not just the bottom rung of the food web. They are in many ways the most important biological actors in the deep ocean system, the entities that process the enormous quantities of organic material that sink from the surface, cycle the chemical elements on which all life depends, and in doing so shape the chemistry of the ocean and the atmosphere on a global scale. The abundance of microorganisms in the deep ocean is extraordinary. There are estimated to be more bacterial cells in the ocean than there are stars in the observable universe, a comparison that is simultaneously meaningless and illuminating, capturing in a single image the sheer, almost incomprehensible scale of microbial life on this planet. The deep ocean, and particularly the deep ocean sediments, harbor an enormous proportion of this microbial biomass. Populations of organisms living deep in the sediment, far below the sediment surface, in conditions of extreme pressure, cold, and near complete absence of energy sources, growing at rates so slow that individual cells may divide only once every few thousand years. These slow-growing, deep sediment microorganisms represent a category of life that we are only beginning to understand, life at the very edge of the minimum energy requirements for biological activity. The question of how slowly a microorganism can grow and still be considered alive, still be carrying out the metabolic processes that define life, is not merely philosophical. It has direct implications for our understanding of what constitutes a habitable environment, both on Earth and on other worlds. Researchers studying these deep sediment microorganisms have found evidence of active metabolism at depths of hundreds of meters into the seafloor sediment, depths that correspond to rock ages of millions of years. The organisms living at these depths are not dormant spores waiting for better conditions. They are actively, if incredibly slowly, metabolizing, processing the tiny amounts of chemical energy available in the ancient organic material buried in the sediment, maintaining the molecular machinery of their cells against the constant thermodynamic pressure toward disorder. How they do this, and what limits the maximum depth and age of sediment in which active life can persist, are among the most actively investigated questions in the field of deep biosphere research. The deep biosphere, the totality of microbial life that exists beneath the ocean floor and beneath the continents, in pore spaces and fractures in rock down to depths of several kilometers, represents a substantial fraction of the total biomass of life on Earth. Estimates of its size have increased dramatically over the past several decades as researchers have developed better techniques for detecting and characterizing microbial life in extreme deep subsurface environments. Current estimates suggest that the deep biosphere may contain as much carbon as all of the plants on Earth's surface, a staggering quantity, and one that represents a completely unsuspected reservoir of biological activity and ecological function. The implications of this recognition, that life is not just a surface phenomenon, but extends kilometers into the solid rock of the planet, are profound in multiple dimensions. For the understanding of Earth's carbon cycle and its role in climate regulation, the deep biosphere represents a reservoir and a flux that must be accounted for. For the understanding of the origins of life, the discovery that life can exist in conditions very similar to those that may have prevailed in the early Earth's subsurface environments provides important evidence for theories of deep subsurface origin. And for the search for life on other worlds, the existence of a vigorous deep biosphere on Earth demonstrates that the requirements for habitable environments are far less restrictive than surface-centric thinking would suggest. One of the most dramatic and visually arresting phenomena of the deep ocean is an event known as a deep-sea landslide, or, in the technical terminology, a submarine mass movement. These events, which can involve the sudden displacement of enormous volumes of sediment from the edges of continental shelves, are among the most powerful geological events that occur on Earth's surface, though they play out far from human observation, beneath kilometers of water, in a silence that is broken only by the acoustic signatures that propagate through the ocean for thousands of kilometers. The continental margins, the sloping boundaries between the shallow continental shelves and the deep ocean basins, are places where sediment accumulates over long periods in thick, unstable deposits. Rivers carrying eroded material from the continents deliver enormous quantities of sediment to the continental margins, and over geological time, these deposits build up into thick piles that can become gravitationally unstable. When a trigger event, an earthquake, a rapid change in sediment loading, the destabilization of methane hydrates disturbs the delicate equilibrium, an enormous mass of sediment can begin to move downslope. Once in motion, these slides can travel at extraordinary speeds, reaching velocities of tens of meters per second, and can involve volumes of sediment measured in the thousands of cubic kilometers. The consequences of large submarine landslides can be felt far beyond the ocean floor. As a large mass of sediment suddenly displies downslope, it displaces an enormous volume of water, which propagates outward as a tsunami, a series of long wavelength waves that can travel across entire ocean basins and upon reaching coastlines can reach devastating heights. Some of the largest tsunamis in geological history are believed to have been generated not by earthquakes but by submarine landslides, and the potential for future large submarine mass movements to generate devastating tsunamis is an area of active research in marine hazard assessment. The Storegga slide, which occurred approximately 8,150 years ago off the coast of Norway, is one of the best documented examples of a large submarine landslide. Involving the displacement of approximately 3,500 cubic kilometers of sediment, the Storegga slide generated a tsunami that swept across the North Sea and struck the coastlines of what are now Norway, Scotland, and other parts of northern Europe. Geological evidence for the tsunami, in the form of marine sediment deposited well above normal sea level, has been found at multiple locations around the North Sea, and some researchers have speculated that the event would have been catastrophic for the coastal hunter-gatherer populations living in these areas at the time. The Storegga slide occurred during a period when much of what is now the North Sea was still above sea level. The post-glacial rise in sea level had not yet completely flooded the shallow northern European shelf. The communities living in the coastal areas affected by the tsunami would have been among those hunter-gatherer peoples whose settlements and material culture have subsequently been drowned by the continuing rise in sea level. The same people whose footprints, tools, and structures are now being discovered by underwater archaeologists exploring the drowned landscape of what was once Doggerland, the low-lying land that connected what is now Britain to the European continent. Doggerland is one of the most fascinating drowned landscapes in the world, a vast, low-lying plain that was fully submerged by approximately 8,000 years ago, after the post-glacial rise in sea level and potentially accelerated in its final stages by the Storegga tsunami. At its maximum extent during the depths of the last glacial period, Doggerland stretched from what is now the English coast to what is now the Dutch, German, and Danish coasts, a territory of perhaps 100,000 square kilometers that would have been some of the most productive and habitable land in northern Europe. Rivers flowed through it, lakes and wetlands dotted its surface, animals roamed it. And people lived on it, hunted its game, fished its rivers, and left behind the traces of their lives that are now resting on the floor of the North Sea, covered in sediment, waiting to be found. The systematic archaeological investigation of Doggerland has been ongoing since the late 20th century, driven in large part by the accidental discoveries made by North Sea fishermen whose nets have periodically brought up not fish but bones. The bones of mammoths, aurochs, and other Pleistocene megafauna, along with occasional human artifacts including worked flint tools, harpoon points, and even a piece of what appears to be a worked bone or antler artifact. These accidental finds have been gradually supplemented by deliberate archaeological survey using side-scan sonar, sub-bottom profiler technology, and careful analysis of sediment cores, building up a picture of the submerged landscape and its former inhabitants that is both scientifically fascinating and deeply moving in its human implications. The people of Doggerland were Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, skilled, mobile, adaptable people who had successfully colonized the post-glacial landscape of northern Europe and developed sophisticated technologies and social organizations for exploiting the rich resources of their environment. Their world was slowly, inexorably shrinking as sea levels rose, a process that would have been perceptible on the timescale of a human lifetime, as coastlines retreated and familiar hunting grounds disappeared beneath the encroaching sea. They adapted, as human beings always do, retreating to higher ground, shifting their resource base, adjusting their territories. But eventually, the land was entirely gone, and the people either merged with the communities of the European mainland, or, if the Storegga tsunami hypothesis is correct, faced a catastrophic and sudden acceleration of the process that may have been devastating to their population. The story of Doggerland is, in microcosm, the story of every drowned coastal landscape in the world, a story of people living at the edge of an advancing sea, adapting and retreating, and ultimately losing the battle with the inexorable physics of a warming, melting world. It is a story that is written in the sediment of the North Sea floor, waiting to be fully read. The investigation of drowned landscapes and their human inhabitants is part of a broader revolution in underwater archaeology that has been made possible by advances in survey technology over the past few decades. High-resolution multi-beam sonar can now map the seafloor with sufficient detail to identify individual large boulders, to trace the outlines of ancient river channels and lake shorelines, and to detect the subtle topographic signatures of human-made structures buried under sediment. Sub-bottom profiler technology can penetrate through meters of sediment to image the stratigraphy beneath the seafloor surface. Remotely operated vehicles equipped with high-definition cameras and manipulator arms can conduct detailed visual surveys and collect samples from depths far beyond the reach of human divers. These technologies have collectively transformed what is possible in underwater archaeology, and they are revealing a picture of human prehistory that is considerably more complex and extensive than the one derived solely from the study of dry land sites. The coastal zone, the zone that was repeatedly flooded and exposed as sea levels rose and fell over the glacial cycles of the Pleistocene, was preferentially occupied by human populations for most of our species' history. The biological productivity of coastal and estuarine environments, with their rich fisheries, shellfish beds, and diverse terrestrial and aquatic resources, made them the most attractive habitats available to prehistoric hunter-gatherers. And this means that the most densely occupied, most repeatedly inhabited, most culturally productive landscapes of the human past are precisely the ones that are now, in large part, underwater. This recognition has profound implications for our understanding of human prehistory. Many of the key events in the early history of our species, the coastal dispersal of anatomically modern humans out of Africa, the colonization of Australia, the initial settlement of the Americas, likely occurred primarily in coastal environments that are now submerged. The evidence for these dispersal events, preserved in the settlements and material culture of the people who made these journeys, is now resting on the continental shelves of the world's oceans, at depths between a few meters and 120 meters, waiting to be found. Some of this evidence is being found. Underwater excavations off the coasts of various parts of the world have yielded stone tools, the bones of hunted animals, and other artifacts from Pleistocene and early Holocene contexts. In some locations, underwater surveys have revealed the drowned remnants of what appear to have been substantial settlements, concentrations of stone tools and food refuse that suggest repeated or long-term occupation. These discoveries are, at present, relatively rare and often difficult to investigate in detail, given the challenges of underwater excavation. But the field is advancing rapidly, and the pace of discovery is accelerating as more researchers turn their attention to the drowned continental shelves, and as the technology for underwater survey and excavation continues to improve. The picture that is beginning to emerge from all of this work, from the combination of underwater survey, sediment core analysis, ancient DNA studies, and computational modeling of past sea levels and coastal environments, is one of a prehistoric coastal world that was far more populous, far more complex, and far more important to the development of human culture and technology than has previously been recognized. The coastal route hypothesis for the dispersal of modern humans out of Africa, for example, the idea that early modern humans followed the coastline of the Indian Ocean eastward from Africa to South Asia and Southeast Asia, and eventually to Australia, is now supported by substantial genetic evidence, but the physical archaeological evidence for this journey has been almost entirely swallowed by the sea. Finding that evidence, documenting the actual settlements and encampments of the people who made this extraordinary journey, is one of the great challenges and opportunities of modern underwater archaeology. And it is a challenge that requires not just technological capability, but institutional will, the recognition that the most important chapters of human prehistory may be written not in the rock and soil of dry land, but in the sediment of the seafloor, and that investigating them requires a level of investment and commitment comparable to what has been devoted to the great dry land archaeological programs of the past century. Among the most compelling arguments for the importance of underwater archaeology, and for the general principle that the ocean floor holds crucial evidence for understanding human history, is the story of what is happening in the eastern Mediterranean. The Mediterranean Sea, with its long, complex geological history, its tectonic instability, and its central role in the development of the ancient civilizations that most directly shaped the intellectual and cultural heritage of the modern Western world, has been a theater of dramatic environmental change over the past several 100,000 years. The most dramatic of these changes was the Messinian salinity crisis, a geological event that occurred approximately 5.96 to 5.33 million years ago, when the connection between the Atlantic Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea was closed by tectonic uplift, cutting off the inflow of Atlantic water. The result was catastrophic. The Mediterranean, cut off from its main water source and subject to intense evaporation in the hot, dry climate of the region, largely or completely dried up. The Mediterranean basin, today one of the most productive seas in the world, hosting an extraordinary diversity of marine life and serving as the highway of civilizations, became a vast, deeply incised desert, its floor lying as much as 5 kilometers below the surrounding land surface, the accumulated salt of millions of years of evaporation coating its floor in thick deposits. The desiccation ended approximately 5.33 million years ago, when the Atlantic finally broke through the barrier at what is now the Strait of Gibraltar and poured into the Mediterranean basin in what has been called the Zanclean Flood, one of the most dramatic geological events in the relatively recent history of the Earth. The refilling of the Mediterranean may have happened rapidly. Some geological models suggest it could have taken as little as a few thousand years, or even a few hundred years in the final stages, for the basin to return to roughly its present water level. This event, millions of years before human beings existed, is relevant to the present discussion because it left behind a legacy that continues to shape the Mediterranean environment today. The thick salt deposits left by the desiccation underlie much of the Mediterranean seafloor, and their presence has had significant effects on the sedimentation patterns and structural geology of the region. The deep canyons cut into the continental margins of the Mediterranean during the desiccation period, some of them among the largest canyon systems on Earth, provided pathways for the transport of sediment and organic material from the continental shelves to the deep basins, and their legacy in the shape of the continental margins continues to influence how those margins behave today. But the Mediterranean has also been shaped by much more recent environmental changes that are directly relevant to the human history of the region. The Eastern Mediterranean, in particular, has undergone significant changes in sea level over the past 20,000 years, as the melting of the last glacial ice sheets raised sea levels and inundated extensive areas of low-lying coastal land. The Black Sea, connected to the Mediterranean through the narrow Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits, has its own dramatic story of environmental change, involving a possible rapid flood of an approximately 7,500 years ago that has been proposed with considerable controversy as a possible origin for the widespread flood myths found in the cultures of the ancient Near East. The Black Sea hypothesis, advanced most prominently by geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman in the late 1990s, proposed that at the end of the last ice age, the Black Sea was a large, isolated freshwater lake with a water level considerably lower than the present Mediterranean. As Mediterranean sea levels rose following the end of the glaciation, the level of the Mediterranean eventually exceeded the height of the land bridge connecting it to the Black Sea basin at what is now the Bosphorus. At that point, the hypothesis proposes, Mediterranean waters began to pour over the barrier and into the Black Sea basin in a catastrophic flood, rapidly raising the level of the Black Sea and inundating the low-lying shores of the freshwater lake, shores that were, at the time, inhabited by agricultural communities farming and herding on the productive lake margins. The evidence for this hypothesis is partially supported and partially contested by subsequent geological and archaeological investigation. There is clear evidence for a rapid rise in Black Sea water levels at roughly the proposed time, and for the transition from a freshwater to a brackish marine environment that would accompany the influx of Mediterranean water. What is less clear is the rate and character of the flooding, whether it was truly catastrophic on a human timescale or a more gradual process, and whether any human communities in the region experienced it as a sudden, overwhelming disaster of the kind described in flood myths. The archaeological evidence is suggestive but not conclusive. Surveys of the Black Sea floor have documented drowned landscapes with what appear to be ancient shorelines and possibly human-modified features at depths consistent with the pre-flood lake level. But definitive archaeological confirmation of human settlement in the flooded areas, the discovery of clearly artificial structures, tools, or organic remains that can be dated to the pre-flood period, has proved elusive. The broader point, however, is significant regardless of the specific details of the Black Sea case. The human communities of the ancient world lived in a landscape that was significantly different from the present one, and that was subject to dramatic environmental change on timescales that overlapped with human generations. The flooding of coastal areas, the inundation of river valleys, the transformation of lakes into seas, these were not merely abstract geological processes. They were lived experiences, witnessed by human populations who responded to them with the full range of human cognitive and cultural tools: observation, adaptation, storytelling, myth. The flood stories that appear in so many ancient cultures, Mesopotamian, Hebraic, Greek, Indian, and many others, may preserve in mythological form the cultural memory of exactly these kinds of dramatic environmental events. Finding the physical evidence of these events and of the communities that experienced them in the sediment of the seafloor and on the drowned surfaces of former coastlines is one of the most powerful ways we have of connecting the abstract record of geological change with the deeply human story of how people lived and died and remembered in the ancient world. The relationship between the deep ocean and the history of human civilization takes an unexpected and fascinating turn when we consider one of the most technologically sophisticated aspects of ancient maritime culture: the extraordinary capacity of prehistoric and ancient peoples to navigate open ocean by the stars, the waves, and the behavior of birds and marine life. Long before the development of the magnetic compass, the chronometer, or the sextant, human beings were crossing vast stretches of open ocean with a confidence and precision that continues to astonish researchers who study these voyages. The most dramatic example of this capability is the settlement of the Pacific, the colonization of the thousands of islands scattered across the largest ocean on the planet by the ancestors of today's Polynesian, Micronesian, and Melanesian peoples. This achievement, which began approximately 3,500 years ago and culminated in the settlement of Hawaii, New Zealand, and Easter Island within the last 1,000 years, represents the most extensive maritime colonization in the history of our species. It required the development of ocean-going vessels, the double-hulled canoes of Polynesia, capable of sailing into the wind and surviving the open ocean swells of the Pacific, and a navigational system based on detailed observational knowledge of stars, currents, wave patterns, and wildlife that has no parallel in any other tradition of navigation. Polynesian navigators used a system called wayfinding, a comprehensive, holistic approach to navigation that integrated multiple streams of environmental information simultaneously. The stars provided directional information, with different stars rising and setting at different points on the horizon, serving as directional guides for different voyages. The patterns of ocean swells, the long, regular waves generated by distant weather systems and refracted by the presence of islands, provided information about direction and distance that experienced navigators could read by feel, detecting subtle changes in the motion of their vessel that indicated the proximity of land. The behavior of seabirds, the direction from which they flew in the evening, heading back to land to roost, could indicate the direction and distance of islands beyond the visible horizon. This knowledge system was not written down. It was transmitted orally and experientially from master navigators to their apprentices through years of observation and practice. Much of it was nearly lost during the colonial period, when traditional voyaging was suppressed and the social structures that maintained and transmitted navigational knowledge were disrupted. The revival of this tradition, most famously through the work of Polynesian cultural organizations that have reconstructed traditional voyaging canoes and trained new generations of navigators in traditional methods, is one of the most powerful stories of cultural reclamation and restoration in the modern world. But what does Polynesian navigation have to do with the deep ocean and its mysteries? The connection is both practical and philosophical. The environmental information that Polynesian navigators used, the patterns of ocean swells, the behavior of marine wildlife, the distribution of currents and temperature gradients, is generated by the same deep ocean processes that we have been exploring throughout this documentary. The ocean swells that navigators read by feel originate in the movement of the deep ocean, shaped by the topography of the ocean floor and the patterns of thermohaline circulation. The distribution of marine life, the fish, birds, and marine mammals whose behavior served as navigational cues, reflects the biological productivity patterns of the ocean, which are in turn determined by the physical oceanography of the region. Understanding the deep ocean, its circulation, its biology, its chemistry, is not just an exercise in pure scientific inquiry. It is foundational to understanding the full range of human interactions with the sea, from the most ancient to the most contemporary. The ocean is not simply the space between the lands that human beings inhabit. It is a dynamic, complex system that has shaped the distribution and development of human populations throughout the history of our species, providing highways for migration, barriers against contact, resources for sustenance, and environmental signals for navigation. Understanding it deeply, in both senses of that word, is essential for understanding the full complexity of the human story. The question of what the deep ocean might still be hiding in terms of biology, geology, and human history is one that admits no simple answer. What we know with confidence is that our knowledge of the deep ocean is vastly incomplete. Despite decades of oceanographic research, despite the development of increasingly sophisticated survey and sampling technologies, despite the deployment of autonomous underwater vehicles and remotely operated systems capable of reaching the deepest trenches, the overwhelming majority of the deep ocean floor remains unmapped at the resolution required to detect features smaller than a few kilometers in size. This is not a counsel of despair. It is rather an invitation, an open, ongoing invitation to the scientific enterprise to push further, to develop better tools, to ask more refined questions, and to follow the evidence wherever it leads. And the evidence, as we have seen throughout this documentary, leads to places that consistently surprise, consistently challenge, and consistently reward the effort of investigation. Consider for a moment what the past half-century of deep ocean exploration has revealed. In 1960, the Trieste, a bathyscaphe designed by Swiss engineer Auguste Piccard, carried 2 men to the bottom of Challenger Deep for the first time in history, confirming that human technology could survive at the extreme pressures of the deepest ocean. At that time, our knowledge of the deep ocean was almost entirely theoretical. The existence of hydrothermal vents was unknown. The existence of chemosynthetic ecosystems was unknown. The deep biosphere, the microbial communities living in the sediment of the ocean floor, was unknown. The polymetallic nodule chemistry that we now describe as a source of dark oxygen was unknown. The full extent of the Mariana Trench's biological diversity was unknown. In the 60-plus years since that pioneering descent, we have discovered all of these things and many more. We have identified thousands of new species. We have fundamentally revised our understanding of the conditions under which life can exist. We have discovered new forms of energy metabolism that have no parallel in the surface world. We have found evidence of geological processes like the natural electrolysis generating dark oxygen that were not predicted by any existing theory. What will the next 60 years reveal? The honest answer is that we do not know, and that is precisely the point. If the history of deep ocean exploration teaches us anything, it is that the ocean's capacity to surprise us is effectively unlimited. Every major expedition to the deep ocean has returned with findings that were not anticipated before the expedition began. Every advance in survey technology has revealed features and phenomena that the previous generation of technology was not capable of detecting. The deep ocean is not running out of secrets. It is, if anything, revealing only the outermost layer of what it contains. The technological trajectory of deep ocean exploration is pointing in a direction that should make us optimistic about the rate of future discovery. Autonomous underwater vehicles, robotic submarines capable of operating independently for extended periods, covering enormous areas of seafloor and collecting continuous streams of data, are becoming increasingly capable and increasingly affordable. Swarms of these vehicles, working cooperatively, could in principle survey vast areas of the deep ocean floor in far less time than would be required by crewed or remotely operated systems. Advances in acoustic technology are improving our ability to map the seafloor at higher resolution and from greater distances. And advances in sensor technology, chemical sensors, biological sensors, acoustic sensors, are expanding the range of environmental parameters that can be measured continuously and automatically. The combination of these technological advances with the analytical power of artificial intelligence creates the possibility of a truly transformative acceleration in deep ocean science. AI systems capable of analyzing the enormous datasets generated by comprehensive ocean surveys, identifying patterns, detecting anomalies, classifying organisms, mapping geological features, could allow researchers to extract scientific insight from data at a rate that would be completely impossible with manual analysis. The application of similar AI-powered analysis to the Nazca Lines, as we described in Part 1, provides a compelling demonstration of what this kind of technological synergy can achieve. The scientific investigation of the deep ocean does not operate in isolation from the broader context of human activity on this planet. The deep ocean is not just an object of scientific curiosity. It is a system of global importance that provides services and resources essential to human well-being, and it is increasingly subject to pressures that threaten to alter it in ways that could have far-reaching consequences. The deep ocean plays a critical role in the global carbon cycle, absorbing enormous quantities of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through both physical dissolution and biological processes, and storing that carbon in the deep ocean on timescales of centuries to millennia. This carbon uptake by the ocean has significantly slowed the rate of atmospheric carbon dioxide accumulation. Without the ocean's carbon absorption, the changes to the atmospheric composition from human activities would be substantially greater than they have been. But this service comes at a cost. The dissolution of additional carbon dioxide in seawater makes the water more acidic through a process called ocean acidification, and the chemical changes associated with this acidification are already affecting marine organisms, particularly those that build calcium carbonate shells and skeletons. Ocean acidification is occurring globally, affecting all depths and all regions of the ocean. But it is particularly concerning in the deep ocean, where the chemical conditions are already closer to the critical thresholds at which calcium carbonate begins to dissolve. As the deep ocean becomes more acidic, the chemical balance that determines whether calcium carbonate shells and skeletons dissolve or persist shifts in a direction that threatens the long-term preservation of the seafloor sediment record that we have been describing as one of our primary archives of Earth's climate history. The warming of the ocean, a consequence of the same global energy imbalance that is driving changes in the surface climate, is also having measurable effects on the deep ocean. The thermohaline circulation, the slow, global conveyor belt of deep water movement that we described earlier, is sensitive to changes in the temperature and salinity of the surface waters in the regions where deep water forms. Changes in these regions, driven by surface warming and by the addition of freshwater from melting ice sheets, have the potential to slow or disrupt the thermohaline circulation, with cascading effects on ocean chemistry, marine biology, and climate. These are not hypothetical future concerns. They are processes that are already underway, already detectable in ocean observations, already showing measurable effects on marine ecosystems. The deep ocean, for all its remoteness and apparent invulnerability, is not immune to the changes being driven by the altered chemistry of the atmosphere. It is connected slowly, through the pathways of circulation and chemistry, to every part of the Earth system, and what happens at the surface ultimately, inevitably, reaches the deep. Understanding these connections, mapping the pathways and timescales through which surface changes propagate into the deep ocean, and understanding the potential consequences of those changes for deep ocean ecosystems and Earth system function, is one of the most urgent challenges of contemporary oceanographic science. And it requires exactly the kind of comprehensive, sustained, technologically sophisticated observation program that the scientific community has been advocating for decades, but that has been difficult to fund and implement at the required scale. As we approach the final stages of our journey, it is worth stepping back from the specific discoveries and the specific technologies and the specific debates we have been exploring and asking a broader question. What does it all mean? What is the significance, not just scientific but human, existential, philosophical, of the fact that the deepest parts of our oceans still hold fundamental secrets? What does it mean for our self-understanding as a species that we live on a planet whose most extreme environments are only now becoming accessible to investigation? Part of the answer, I think, lies in what discovery itself does to us, what it has always done to us, as a species uniquely characterized by our drive to push past the boundaries of the known. Discovery changes not just what we know, but how we see. When we discover that the deep ocean generates its own oxygen through geological processes, we do not just add a fact to a database. We are forced to reconsider the framework within which we understand the relationships between geology, chemistry, and biology. We are forced to revise the assumptions about what conditions life requires and what processes generate the conditions for life. We are forced to look at the universe with slightly different eyes that see possibility where before they saw only constraint. When we discover that the victims of Pompeii were more diverse, more cosmopolitan, more individually complex than we had previously recognized, we do not just correct a historical record. We are forced to reckon with the ways in which our assumptions and biases shape what we see even when we are trying to see objectively. We are forced to confront the fact that the stories we tell about the past are always, to some degree, stories about ourselves, about what we expect to find, about what categories we impose on the evidence, about whose humanity we are prepared to recognize and whose we are inclined to reduce to stereotype. When we discover that artificial intelligence can find hundreds of previously unknown figures in an archaeological landscape that has been studied for decades, we are forced to grapple with questions about the relationship between human intelligence and machine intelligence, about what each is capable of, about what each misses, about how they might work together in ways that neither could achieve alone. And we find in this specific case that the combination produces something that neither human observers nor machine learning systems working in isolation could have achieved. A more complete picture of a remarkable human cultural achievement, enriched by the complementary strengths of biological and artificial cognition. These realizations, these forced revisions of assumption, these confrontations with the limits of our own perception and understanding are not comfortable. They require intellectual humility. They require the willingness to be wrong, to revise, to hold our current understanding loosely enough that it can be reshaped by new evidence. But they are also, in the deepest sense, what science is for. Not the accumulation of facts, but the continuous refinement of understanding, the endless, recursive process of seeing more clearly, understanding more deeply, and recognizing, each time we reach a new level of clarity, that there is always more beyond. The Mariana Trench, from which we began our journey, continues to surprise us with every investigation. Recent expeditions using the latest generation of deep-diving vehicles have documented organisms and phenomena that were not previously recorded, refining our understanding of life at the extreme of depth and pressure. Among the most recent discoveries made in the deepest reaches of the trench are organisms that appear to have evolved mechanisms for dealing with pressure that differ from those we have previously described, novel biochemical adaptations that suggest evolution has found more than one solution to the problem of surviving at extreme depth, and that the diversity of life at the Hadal Zone is greater and more inventive in its strategies than our current models predict. The microbial community of the Mariana Trench floor has proved to be particularly rich and surprising. Studies of sediment samples recovered from Challenger Deep have revealed microbial communities of extraordinary diversity, communities that include representatives of many different metabolic strategies, including some that appear to be processing chemical compounds